Welcome. Tonight, we drift quietly through time, back to a world of stone towers, flickering torches, and echoing halls. When we think of castles, we often imagine banners in the breeze, noble feasts, armored knights, and tales of glory. But behind those cold walls, life was not a fairy tale. It was a quiet, difficult rhythm of labor, discomfort, and long, silent days. Not everyone in a castle wore a crown. Most wore aprons, ash, or worn-out boots. They rose before the sun, slept in the cold, and moved through the shadows, servants, maids, cooks, scribes, grooms, women whose names were never written, men whose work was never sung. This is not their tragedy. It is simply their truth. And in knowing it, we remember the softness of the present, the comfort of warm blankets, clean water, and peace. Don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. But now, breathe slowly, let your body relax, and let the stone gates of the past open gently. These are 7 harsh truths of medieval castle life, and this is a first. Segment 1. Cold stone, no comfort. Imagine yourself waking before the sun. The room around you is quiet, not the comforting quiet of a warm, familiar space, but the kind of quiet that hums against the ears. Thick, unmoving. You are in a small stone chamber, nestled inside the walls of a medieval castle. No fire glows on the hearth, not yet. The embers from a night before have cooled into a pale scatter of ash, and the air is cold, sharply cold. It clings to your skin even through layers of wool and linen. The stone around you, heavy and unyielding, is not a shield from the cold. It is the source of it. Castles were designed for defense, not for comfort. The walls, sometimes as thick as a grown man is tall, were built to withstand siege engines, arrows, and time itself. They were never meant to keep warmth in. Instead, they absorbed the cold of night and held it, like forgotten memory, long into the day. Even in summer, the mornings inside these walls felt cool, sometimes even unpleasantly so. The moment you stepped barefoot to the floor, the stone beneath your feet would whisper its chill up through your legs. There was no carpet, no insulation, no soft welcome, just a hardness of architecture doing what it was made to do. Endure, not embrace. In winter, it was worse. The cold seeped through everything. It curled into bedding. It lay in the air like fog. You might sleep beside a small brazier, or huddle near the kitchen hearth if you were fortunate. But heat was fleeting, and the walls were not generous. Once the fire died, the cold returned quickly and without mercy. For servants and lower-ranking castle workers, heating was a luxury they could rarely afford. Their quarters were often located in the less protected, colder areas of the castle, underground near storerooms, or tucked along the outer edges where the draft passed most freely. These rooms were functional, not comfortable. Stone on all 4 sides, sometimes a wooden door, often no glass in the windows, only a shutter that might block the worst of the wind if it hadn't warped in the damp. In such a room, your breath would cloud in front of your face in winter. Your fingers would stiffen as you dressed in the gray light of dawn, pulling on woolen hose and wrapping your body in whatever layers you could afford. You might try to sleep in your clothes to keep warm. Many did. Changing into fresh garments was a cold and unpleasant task. So many simply didn't, not until absolutely necessary. There were no warm socks, no central fires, no thick curtains trapping heat. A noble might have a personal fireplace in their solar, tended by a servant. Heavy draperies might hang over their bed to trap a pocket of warmth. But even those luxuries had limits. The ceilings were high, the stones unmoving, and the weather outside rarely stayed outside for long. There are records from castle inventories describing how many logs were assigned to each room, how much fuel was rationed per day. Even among the elite, firewood was managed with care. It had to be brought in by cart, stored, split, dried. It was precious. You didn't keep a fire burning all day just to feel cozy. You lit it when you needed to cook, or when someone fell ill, or when important guests arrived. Otherwise, you simply wore more clothes. Cold also meant moisture. When the air outside grew heavy with fog or rain, the walls absorbed it. Castles were not dry places. They breathed dampness in every season. Mold grew slowly behind tapestries. Wood warped and creaked under persistent moisture. In the lower sections of the castle, cellars, basements, servant halls, the floors might stay wet for days. You could sweep, you could shovel snow from the stairs, but the damp always returned. The chill was not just a discomfort. It was a constant companion. It changed how people slept, how they worked, how they moved through their days. People slept huddled in groups whenever they could. Even those with privacy often kept animals, dogs, cats, sometimes even small livestock, in their chamber for warmth. Not sentiment, just survival. Bedding was layered as best it could be. A straw mattress, perhaps laid over wooden slats or the bare floor. Woolen blankets, or sometimes a single fur, if you were lucky enough. Some castle workers slept wrapped in their cloaks, one hand beneath them, one hand over their face, chasing warmth in the folds of their own garments. Morning came slowly. The stones released their cold grudgingly. You'd rise to stiff limbs and aching joints. Warmth, if it arrived at all, came later, perhaps with breakfast, if there was something hot, or with labor that got your blood moving. The irony is that castles, symbols of power, wealth, permanence, were often some of the coldest places a person could live. Unlike the small timber-framed homes of peasants with low ceilings and thick thatch roofs, a castle's grandeur was also its flaw. High ceilings pulled warmth up and away. Tower rooms, impressive in design, were also the most exposed to wind. Some tried to soften the effect with tapestries on the walls, woven images of hunts, saints, or coats of arms, but these were not decorations. They were insulation. A thick woolen tapestry helped reduce drafts, even if only slightly. Still, a cold wall remained a cold wall. Even the stone floor beneath your bed radiated that chill upward, pressing into the bones. In spring, the thaw was slow. In autumn, the cold returned early. Only in the high summer months might the castle feel momentarily pleasant. But even then, the stone absorbed the sun with reluctance. There was no true relief. Those who served within these walls grew accustomed to discomfort. They didn't complain. They adjusted. They worked in layers. They wrapped hot stones in cloth to place beneath their bedding. They stood near open ovens for a moment's warmth when passing through the kitchen. Some caught fever. Others developed persistent coughs. Cold was not a season. It was a state of being. And so the stone remained, year after year, silently guarding the misery it helped create. When travelers came and marveled at the towering gates, the crenellated towers, the echo of drums and the shine of banners, they saw strength. But those who lived inside, they saw breath turning to mist. They felt damp bedding. They heard the wind slip beneath the doors at night. And they woke each morning not to comfort, but to the endless labor of warming a place that did not wish to be warm. Still they endured, as the walls endured, quietly, coldly, without complaint. The castle has begun to stir. You can hear the muted sounds of movement, footsteps on stone, the dull thump of a door closing gently in the next corridor, a broom dragged across flagstones. You rise slowly from your straw bedding, adjusting your cloak around your shoulders, and feel the chill that hasn't lessened from the night before. You're not alone in the room, but no one speaks. Each person moves through the cold as if it were something they know well, because they do. In this part of the castle, tucked between the outer wall and the kitchens, there is no fireplace. There is, perhaps, a brazier down the corridor, an iron basin where coals might be lit during colder months. But no fire crackles in this chamber. No stone hearth casts dancing shadows or offers comfort. There is only the cold, the quiet, the walls. In popular imagination, castles are filled with roaring fires and flickering torchlight. But in truth, fire was rare, fire was precious, and fire was expensive. A fireplace was not a decorative feature. It was a resource, and like all valuable things, it was rationed. In medieval castles, fireplaces were typically built in great halls, private chambers of the lord or lady, and occasionally in a chapel or solar. These were places of importance. Spaces where status demanded a measure of comfort, or where warmth served a political or symbolic role. To be seen beside a fire was to be important. To be near the hearth was to be part of the inner circle. But for the many others who made the castle function, cooks, laundresses, scullions, grooms, guards, there were no such privileges. Servant quarters, even in large castles, were often built in corners and corridors the fire never touched. Their ceilings were lower, their walls more damp. Their days began before any fire was lit, and often ended long after the last coal had been raked over. Even in workspaces where fire was present, like the kitchen or bakehouse, it was not always a source of comfort. A kitchen hearth, for example, might blaze for hours to roast a pig or boil vast pots of stew, but the heat was directional, inconsistent. One side of your body might burn with warmth, while your other side still shivered. And the air was rarely clean, thick with smoke, grease, and the scent of overboiled cabbage. In the Great Hall, where the fire was most grand, the effect was more symbolic than practical. These hearths were vast, sometimes central, sometimes built into wall, and designed to serve dozens, sometimes hundreds of people during feasts. But they were also inefficient by modern standards. The stonework above the fireplace absorbed much of the heat. Chimneys, if they existed, drew warmth upward, and the sheer size of the rooms made it impossible for any fire to warm them evenly. You might sit close to the fire and feel your face flush with heat, but your back would remain cold. Step a few paces away, and the warmth vanished into the void. In fact, medieval chroniclers noted this very thing, that the nobility kept cloaks uneven at table, that drafts moved across the floor despite the fire, and that servants were expected to move swiftly, with no time to warm themselves. Wood for these fires was not endless. It had to be harvested, chopped, dried, and stored. Forests were controlled resources. The lord of the castle had rights over timber, and when collection was organized and monitored, a fire that burned wastefully was a fire that cost the state. And so, even when fires were lit, they were managed with discipline. Logs added only when needed. Embers stirred just enough to cook a stew, or take the chill from a chamber before the fire was allowed to fade. In many castles, regulations were put in place. The number of logs issued to each part of the household might be recorded by a steward. Only certain rooms were permitted fires during the day. You might have a fire in the main hall during winter, but not in spring. You might light the kitchen oven in the morning, but it would go cold by night. In the personal chambers of the lord or lady, the fire was more consistent, but it, too, was small. These fires were often housed in hooded fireplaces or wall-mounted hearths. They smoked, they hissed, they burned unevenly, and still they were treasured. The fireplace was tended by a specific servant, often a boy or a young page whose job was to carry the wood, stoke the embers, and keep the warmth from vanishing too soon. Yet even these private fires could not warm the whole room. Most heat escaped upward. That's why the bed became a fortress of its own, enclosed with curtains, layered with furs, padded with wool and linen to trap whatever warmth might be held. In fact, warmth in a medieval castle came more often from bodies than from fire. Servants slept in groups. Even some nobles shared sleeping chambers with companions or family, not just for social reasons, but for warmth. In the servant halls, it was not uncommon for 5 or more workers to sleep in the same room, sometimes even huddled on the same bedding. Dogs were welcome. Even pigs in the poorest households might be brought into stone corridors to prevent them from freezing outside. When fire was unavailable, movement became a form of heat. Castle workers stayed active, hauling water, scrubbing floors, fetching supplies, keeping a rhythm of daily life going, not just to fulfill their duties, but to keep the cold at bay. It is easy to forget how difficult warmth was to come by. Today, we tap a screen, adjust a dial, or reach for a heated blanket. But in the castles of Europe, warmth was earned slowly, kept carefully, and rationed like treasure. A single log could mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. A fire going out at night could mean a day spent shivering until it could be relit. And so, while fire did exist in the castle, it was not universal, not guaranteed, not kind. Those who lived near it were fortunate. Those who didn't, they lived with cold as a constant companion, moving through damp corridors and shadowed staircases with the knowledge that the hearth would not be waiting for them. They learned to adapt, to wrap heated stones in cloth, to sew fur into sleeves, to light candles more for comfort than warmth. They endured rooms where breath clouded in the morning, where hands stiffened before the first chore, where silence echoed louder because no crackling fire filled the space. And still, the castle stood. The people worked. The fire, when it did burn, became something almost sacred. Not just heat, but hope, a flickering promise that even in a world built from stone and shadow, something gentle could glow. You find yourself drawn toward the wall, where a sliver of dawn has begun to creep through a narrow window. It is not a window in the sense we know today, not a pane of glass, nor a wide view of the world beyond. It is a slit no more than the width of your hand, set deep into the stone, a mere arrow loop designed for defense, not delight. The morning light that seeps through it is pale, strained by the thickness of the wall. It does not spill across the floor. It only suggests its presence, like a ghost that barely touches the surface of things. In summer, it brings glare and insects. In winter, it brings a cold. Castles were not built with comfort in mind. They were constructed to endure siege, to withstand attack. And so, the windows were small, intentionally so. They let in little light, and even less warmth. Most were unglazed, especially in servant areas and minor chambers. The wealthiest nobles might afford horn panes, thin slices of animal horns scraped and flattened, or even expensive imported glass in rare cases. But for most, the openings in the wall remained bare. In the cold seasons, these windows were shuttered with wood, thick, often warped, sometimes bound in iron. They creaked when opened. They groaned when the wind pressed against them. And when they were closed, they blocked not just a chill, but what little natural light the room might receive. The result was a world of half-shadows. Servants awoke in darkness. They dressed by touch. Their eyes adjusted to dimness, so well that moving from one part of the castle to another could disorient them. Stairwells spiraled in shadow. Corridors remained unlit except by the occasional torch or candle, and those only where truly necessary. Rain did not stay outside. It slipped through cracks, pooled on windowsills, soaked the edge of beds placed too close to the outer walls. Curtains helped, sometimes, but not always. Wind forced its way in, uninvited and insistent. It howled through narrow spaces. It rattled loose shutters. It moved tapestries on the wall as though they breathed. And with it came the sound. Castles were rarely silent in the ways one might hope. There was the echo of steps, yes, and the murmur of distant conversations. But through these unsealed windows came the noises of the outside world, not softened but sharpened by the stone. Dogs barking far below, carts creaking over frozen earth, the moan of wind in empty towers. Those tasked with sleeping or working near the walls heard these sounds nightly. They became part of the rhythm of castle life. In time, one learned to recognize the wind from the north as colder, meaner. One learned the sound of rain on the shutters versus sleet. You could even guess the hour of night by the way the wind fell or rose. At times, these openings also served as watch points. A guard might peer out, squinting through sleet or snow, scanning the horizon for movement. In daylight, a cook might hang a cloth over one, letting the light pass through oil-soaked linen to act as a makeshift lamp. In truth, the people who lived within these walls found countless small ways to cope, but they were coping, not thriving. The lack of proper windows shaped more than visibility. It shaped mood, behavior, even health. Modern studies show how vital sunlight is to the human body. In medieval castles, light was rare and dim and fleeting. People developed illnesses we now understand as related to vitamin deficiency and lack of exposure. They also lived by candlelight, when candles were available. For many, tasks like sewing, cooking, or writing were done by the weakest in natural light, or not done at all once darkness fell. Candles were expensive. Wax was reserved for the chapel. Tallow, made from rendered animal fat, was cheaper, but it stank and smoked and added little to the comfort of the room. So the windows, so small and so simple, became symbols of much more. They represented all the things a castle could not provide: warmth, light, openness, clarity. For those of higher rank, the experience was only slightly better. Their windows might be larger, but they too suffered drafts. Even stained glass installations in chapels or solars were not insulated. They were beautiful but cold and fragile. Noble women embroidered by these windows, squinting at their work as daylight moved slowly across the wall. Children might be taught their letters by the same faint beams. A favored pet might sleep where the light fell, only to wake chilled as soon as the sun moved. The architecture power did not reward gentleness. It shielded the body but forgot the spirit. Even the view itself was limited. A window set deep into a wall creates a tunnel of perspective. One did not see the countryside spread wide, but only a portion of sky, a sliver of courtyard, a wedge of forest. The world outside always seemed further than it was. And perhaps, for those inside, that distance felt both cruel and comforting. To live in a castle was to be protected, but also to be confined. So they learned to live by partial light, to stitch in gloom, to read with effort, to memorize faces by firelight, and navigate corridors by habit. And in the morning, as now, they watched the light return slowly through those narrow gaps, painting thin lines across the floor. The day began not with brightness, but with gray suggestion. And still it was enough. Enough to see the dust rise as someone passed. Enough to see your breath curl in the cold air. Enough to know that outside, the world continued, even if the window could not show it clearly. Let us now continue, moving deeper into the castle, to the work that never ended and the meals that rarely satisfied. Even as the fire faded and the morning crept through the narrow stone slit, the cold remained. It pressed in from the walls, it seeped through the floors, and it curled around the body like a second, unwelcome skin. There were no padded parkas, no fleece-lined trousers, no thermal socks. In a medieval castle, warmth came from one source more than any other: layers. Clothing was not fashion, it was protection. Every layer mattered. First, the linen shift, soft if well made, often rough and scratchy if not. It was worn close to the skin, meant to wick away sweat and dirt, to be washed more frequently than the heavier outer layers. For many, it was the only piece of clothing that touched their skin directly. Over that came a tunic or a gown, depending on gender and class. For working folk, this might be a coarse wool, thick and heavy. The lanolin in the wool offered some natural resistance to moisture, a blessing in a place where cold and dampness lingered year-round. For wealthier residents, finer wool, or even silk might be used, though it offered little in the way of warmth on its own. Then came the surcoat, the outer tunic, often sleeveless for laborers and belted at the waist. Its purpose was not only to protect the underlayers from grime, but to trap the small warmth generated by the body and keep it close. In especially cold seasons, more might be added. Cloaks of wool, lined with fur as status permitted. Hoods, coifs, or caps to preserve body heat. Hands were wrapped in woolen mitts or simply pulled into sleeves when idle. Feet were swaddled in thick hose, sometimes two pairs if available. For most servants, clothing was issued or inherited. There was little opportunity to own multiple garments. What you wore during the day might also be your blanket at night. You learned to sleep curled, conserving heat under the folds of your own attire. Tailoring was basic for the lower classes. Clothes were loose, adjusted with belts or pins, easier to layer but less effective at sealing in warmth. Drafts found their way through seams. Rain soaked fabric quickly, and once wet, wool was slow to dry. Upper classes had some advantage, more garments, better fit, finer weave. But even the lady in her solar, or the young squire in training, had contend with the temperature. They wrapped themselves in multiple layers, not for beauty, but for survival. And clothing was heavy, not just in weight, but in fatigue. To wear 3 or 4 layers while cleaning chambers, tending fires, hauling water, it tired the body quickly. And yet, to remove a layer meant inviting the cold. It was a constant balance. Children learned early. They were bundled by their mothers, wrapped tightly in whatever scraps of cloth could be spared. As they grew, they learned which parts of the castle were warmest, where to stand during prayers to catch the sun, how to roll their cloaks to serve as a pillow without letting the chill reach their neck. Hygiene added another burden. Since laundering was laborious, underclothes were worn until soiled beyond comfort. Linen grew stiff, wool itched, and changing meant braving the air with exposed skin, however briefly. In the evenings, before the fire was allowed to die, clothing was aired if possible. Garments were hung near the hearth, rotated so each part received some heat. But there was always the risk of scorching. Burned clothes were not easily replaced. There were no wardrobes in most servant quarters. Clothes were folded and kept in chests if available, or simply piled neatly near the bedding. Mice might find them. Damp might creep in. But they were guarded like treasure because they were clothing defined class. A fur-lined hood signaled status. A gown dyed with expensive pigments marked the upper rank. But beneath those symbols were people still shivering, still wrapping fingers in cloth, still pulling sleeves over reddened knuckles. Even during feasts when finery was displayed, warmth came second to appearance. Lords and ladies sat in cold halls, their finest clothing layered beneath ceremonial garb, and quietly endured the chill for the sake of ceremony. And when the guests left and the fire was doused, they retreated to their chambers, drew the curtains around their beds, and wrapped themselves once again in wool, linen, and fur. For those with status, the layering of clothes could become a mark of elegance. Multiple tunics in complementary shades, carefully folded sleeves, embroidered hems. But even the most well-appointed wardrobe could not promise warmth. There were accounts of noble women wearing silk-lined kirtles beneath velvet overgowns, only to fall ill with chills after a damp winter feast. Servants tasked with dressing them worked quickly, hands red and rough from cold water, lacing up bodices in the dimness of the early hours. Layering clothing was a universal task, crossing social lines. Whether you were a lord or a stable boy, you began each day considering what to wear, not to impress, but to survive. You learned the textures by feel, chose which tunic still held some warmth, which cloak was least stiff from moisture. You learned how to walk in layers, how to bend and lift without unraveling the insulation you'd built upon your body. And when sleep came, many kept their clothes on. The thought of peeling away warmth into the night air was too much to bear. Bedding was shared, but not often clean. To remove clothing was to risk more than a chill. It was to gamble comfort in a world where comfort was rare. In every corner of the castle, warmth was something you wore. It was stitched into sleeves, wrapped around necks, tied at the waist. It rustled when you moved. It caught on nails and splinters. It weighed you down. And even then, it was never quite enough. When the day ended and the final embers of the hearth turned to ash, there was no guarantee of rest. There was only the stone, the straw, and the cold. In medieval castles, sleep was not a comfort. It was a compromise. It was something sought but not always found, especially for those who served. Most servants and laborers slept in shared quarters tucked away in corners of the castle far from warmth. Sometimes these rooms were above the kitchens, where a faint trace of residual heat rose through the floors. More often, they were along the outer walls or in loft spaces under roof, where wind howled through gaps in the wood or stone. There was no insulation, no plaster or padding, just the raw surface of the castle itself, unforgiving, cold, and unmoved by the rhythms of human life. Beds were simple constructions, if they existed at all, a wooden frame, if one was fortunate. More commonly, it was a sack of straw laid over bare stone. Sometimes this sack was shared between 2, 3, or even 4 people. The straw inside flattened quickly, losing its spring and its warmth, and had to be replaced regularly to prevent mold, mites, and the encroachment of damp. There were no mattresses in the modern sense. There were no springs to cradle the body. What sleep was found came through exhaustion more than ease. Servants laid down in their clothes, wrapped in cloaks if they had them, curled tightly to preserve heat. They huddled together, drawing warmth from shared breath and body heat. Sometimes a dog was allowed to sleep at the foot of the bedding, not as a pet, but as a furnace with fur. The better quarters, reserved for officers or high-ranking servants, might include a wooden frame with ropes or planks stretched across to hold a layer of rushes or straw. In such cases, the sleeper might be given a blanket, a coarse woolen thing, stiff from use, but still a treasured luxury. For the nobility, beds were grander but not always warmer. A canopy bed, tall and heavy, offered height and space, but also trapped cold above and below. That is why heavy curtains were drawn around the bed, creating a small pocket of insulation. These curtains were lined, sometimes furred, and drawn tight each night like the wrappings of a cocoon. Even in the Lord's chamber, the stone floors remained cold. Rugs, when present, were laid down more for temperature than beauty. Feet placed upon the ground first thing in the morning encountered chill that seeped instantly through skin. Bed covers were layered thick, linen sheets, woolen blankets, fur throws. The layering was both art and necessity. Sleep came beneath the weight of fabric, not for comfort, but for warmth. Movement was limited. Waking up meant stirring in darkness, unwrapping from warmth reluctantly, and bracing for the cold. Chambers were not private sanctuaries. Most servants slept in rooms shared with others. Privacy was rare. You heard your neighbor's breath, their cough, their dreams whispered into the dark. Snores, shivers, sighs, all became part of the nighttime symphony. And sleep was often broken. Those who worked in kitchens, stables, or halls might be called to their duties before sunrise. Some rose in the darkness to tend fires, others to prepare food, fetch water, or clean ash. The rhythm of castle life did not always allow for full rest. Infestations made rest more difficult. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs were common. Straw bedding had to be changed often, but this was laborious and not always possible. The scent of damp straw, mingled with body odor and the ever-present smoke of the hearth, lingered in every sleeping space. Servants often developed chronic pain from poor sleep conditions. Aching joints, sore backs, and respiratory problems plagued those who lived closest to the stone. Even the wealthier residents were not immune. Cold night air crept into every room, unless a fire was kept burning on the hearth. A rare privilege even for lords. One depended entirely on bedding to hold the warmth. And sometimes, even that failed. Children cried from cold. Elders struggled to rise. In the dead of winter, sleep became a negotiation with discomfort. And yet, there was a kind of ritual to it. Clothes were folded carefully and placed nearby. Hot stones were warmed in the fire and wrapped in cloth to be tucked at the foot of the bed. Some sang softly or prayed before sleep. Others lay still, listening to the wind scrape across the castle walls. Sleep did not come easily, but it did come, eventually, brought on by fatigue, made bearable by habit, and endured in the same way so much of castle life was endured. Quietly, patiently, without complaint. To sleep in a medieval castle was to accept cold as your companion, to lie beside stone and straw in silence, and to find in it the smallest thread of peace. In many parts of the castle, especially those below ground or near the kitchens, warmth came with a price. It was not the crisp, dry heat of a hearth in winter, but a damp, lingering warmth that clung to walls and clothing and skin. Humidity was a constant presence. The kitchens were filled daily with the hiss of boiling water, the steam of stews, and the endless washing of pots. Water splashed from wooden buckets. Spills soaked into the stone floors. Steam rose and had nowhere to go. In castles without proper ventilation, which was most, that moisture simply hung in the air. It gathered in corners. It settled into bedding. It seeped into beams. In the lower levels near the wells, storage cellars, or pantries, the air often felt thick and close. The scent of mold was not sharp or alarming. It was simply part of the background. Those who slept near these areas, cooks, cellar workers, guards stationed near the stores, breathed this air nightly. It was heavy with the smell of damp wood, overripe produce, fermenting barrels, and slowly decaying straw. The air was warm but oppressive, laden with unseen spores that crept in the lungs as easily as dust. In time, breathing it became normal. Coughing became a habit. Clearing the throat before speaking, second nature. Clothing left on the floor grew musty overnight. Shoes never fully dried. Wall hangings and bedding absorbed moisture like sponges. On the walls themselves, pale green patches of mold slowly crept through mortar and across surfaces, especially in winter when the walls could not dry. Mornings revealed small, dark spots blooming along corners, behind storage chests or beneath wooden shelves. Respiratory ailments were common. Servants who worked in or slept near these areas coughed frequently, complained of tight chests, or grew hoarse without explanation. There were no words for things like mold spores or chronic bronchitis. Only the observation that some people never stopped coughing. Some described it as a heaviness in the chest, or the cold that doesn't leave. Others simply adapted, living with breath that rattled faintly at night, and waking with throats raw from the damp. The sick were often moved to quieter quarters, if available, but rarely treated. Herbal remedies could ease symptoms. A tea of thyme or marshmallow root, a poultice of mustard seed, or elder, but these were stopgaps, not solutions. And the castle itself offered no escape from the damp. It was part of the architecture. Moisture lived in its bones. Even nobility suffered in their own way. Rooms above the kitchens were warmer, yes, but often held the scent of cooking and moisture that rose through floorboards. In the summer, food rotted more quickly. In winter, condensation clung to walls and windows, leaving a fine slickness that never quite disappeared. Robes left hanging too long near the wall grew mottled. Books, if kept in the wrong place, warped and bloomed with tiny black flecks between the pages. In storage rooms, the problem worsened. Barrels of wine, salted meats, sacks of flour, all needed to be kept cool, but the stone walls and earthen floors encouraged moisture. Leaks from rain or melting snow crept in unnoticed until mold had taken hold. Mold that spoiled food, mold that caused bread to ferment too early, cheese to sour before its time, mold that lived beneath the floor rushes and climbed into the bones of the castle. Workers tasked with managing these rooms lived in that air daily. They breathed it, they wore it, they carried it with them when they left. Their clothing smelled faintly of mildew, even when clean. Their hair, their hands, their breath, marked by the air of their labor. Visitors noticed it, though they rarely spoke of it. Over time, stone itself darkened, with beams warped, floor rushes molded faster. Grain swelled and split, locks rusted, hinges groaned. These were not signs of neglect. They were the natural outcome of life in an unventilated fortress of stone. And no one was surprised. It was simply part of life inside a living, breathing stone building. You learn not to place blankets too close to the wall. You learn to lift your shoes before bed. You learn the weight of damp in your clothes and the taste of it in your breath. You learn to sleep beside it, to eat with it, to carry it in your lungs. The castle, built to withstand enemies, could not resist the quiet siege of moisture, and those within it endured the slow erosion of health with the same stoic patience they gave to every other discomfort. And still they worked. They lived. They laid their heads on damp straw and coughed into the dark, listening to water drip somewhere unseen. They woke to ceilings spotted with moisture, to walls weeping in the cold, and they accepted it. This, too, was part of the rhythm. Not loud, not fast, but persistent, like breath through the night, like water through stone. Now, let's take one final step deeper into the heart of cold comfort, where stone itself seemed to sigh with age, and nothing stayed dry for long. Chapter 2. Endless work, empty stomachs. The day in a medieval castle did not begin with sunlight. It began in darkness. A darkness broken only by the flicker of a torch, or the muted glow of coals stirred back to life by hands still heavy with sleep. Before the cocks crowed, before nobles stirred in their beds, the servants were already awake. Rising quietly, often without words, they moved through corridors still hushed and cold, beginning the first of many duties that would fill the hours ahead. Cooks arrived in the kitchen when the hearth was little more than a smudge of ash. It was their task to reignite it, coaxing flame from ember. They gathered firewood stacked damp from the night air. They fetched water from the well, cold and heavy in sloshing pails. The stone beneath their feet was already stained from years of drips and spills. The morning meal would not make itself. Porridge required constant stirring. Bread dough had to be kneaded before sunrise. Stews were begun before the sky brightened. In the colder months, the act of washing root vegetables could numb fingers to the bone. Meat, if it was part of the meal, had to be salted, scraped, and hung the day before, a process neither quick nor clean. The work was physical. Sacks of grain had to be hauled across uneven floors. Cauldrons were suspended over open flames, their contents needing to be stirred with long wooden paddles. Burns were common, cuts were constant, and yet there was no room for injury. Those who could stand worked. Elsewhere, cleaners moved to the great hall, collecting refuse left from the evening before. Scraps of food, goblets smeared with wine, muddy footprints dragged across rush-covered floors. They swept in silence. If there was time, They changed the rushes, not just to freshen the scent, but to absorb the day's spills yet to come. They dusted the high window ledges, beat the tapestries with rods, polished the iron wall sconces, carried linens from the washing quarters to the bedchambers, balancing baskets larger than their torsos. Some cleaned without being told. Others waited for a bell. All did so under the unspoken pressure of being seen but not heard, of completing tasks before a noble noticed they had not yet been done. These first tasks were only the beginning. Once the castle began to stir, a cascade of demands would follow. Fires in the noble chambers had to be lit, linens folded and refolded, water basins carried up steep, uneven stairs, chamber pots emptied with practiced efficiency. There were no breaks, no pause between duties. One task flowed into the next. After breakfast, the process of preparing midday meals began. The hearth never cooled. The knives never stopped moving. Ingredients were chopped, ground, and stirred in endless rhythm. The smell of food simmering filled the air, yet none of it belonged to those cooking it. Cleaners scrubbed steps, brushed ash from hearths, polished metalwork, and dusted tapestries that hung too high to reach without a ladder. Some fetched water over and over again, a duty simple in concept, but exhausting in repetition. Buckets were filled, carried, emptied, and returned. The weight left red grooves in hands. Feet blistered, backs ached. Yet none of these were spoken of, and all of this occurred beneath the surface of castle life. The servants did not speak loudly. They did not announce their labor. They moved quietly, as though trying not to exist. To be noticed was often to be reprimanded. A misstep, a spill, a raised voice, these were not forgiven. They were remembered. Evening brought no relief. Dinner was the grandest meal of the day and required its own choreography. Platters were arranged. Roast turned over open flames. Sauces thickened. The scents that filled the air, herb, smoke, fat, onion, and spice, were a cruel reminder that the cooks themselves would eat only after the guests had finished. Not just after, much later and with less. Cleanup was just as grueling. Dishes washed by hand, bones discarded, fires tamped down. The kitchens were left dark again, but still warm from the breath of the day. Water sloshed across stone floors. The sound of scrubbing echoed against the walls. Brooms swept not just ash, but fatigue. Only then, sometimes near midnight, did the last servant slip away to sleep. If they were lucky, if they had finished every task, if they had not been called back to do something again. And even then, their dreams were haunted by the rhythm of their labor. The sound of ladles scraping iron pots, the splash of water into stone basins, the quiet hum of effort never acknowledged. Such was the day and the night of the unseen. Those whose hours began before the sun and ended long after it sank behind the castle walls. This was not a job. It was a life. A rhythm measured in chores, not in clock hands. A kind of quiet devotion to the machinery of survival. An existence held together by obligation, repetition, and the hope that the next day might not be harder than the last. Let us now look closer at the food they prepared but rarely enjoyed, and the hunger that lingered, even in places built for feasts. The food that passed through the kitchens of a medieval castle could be extravagant. Platters of roasted meat, golden pies filled with spices, and towering displays meant to dazzle noble guests. But these feasts were not for the hands that prepared them. For the majority of those who worked behind the scenes, the cooks, the scullery maids, the errand boys, meals were a far simpler affair if they came at all. A typical meal for castle staff was built from the bottom of the barrel. Dark rye or barley bread, coarse and dense, sometimes stale from sitting too long. Cabbage, often boiled until it surrendered both color and flavor, was a staple, not by choice but by availability. Broths were thin, made from bones long since stripped of their meat, stretched with water and a few tired vegetables, if any could be spared. Protein was scarce. Meat was a luxury reserved for the upper table. On rare occasions, scraps might be passed down, a chicken wing with most of the meat gone, or a bit of stew scraped from the bottom of the pot. These were prized morsels, not daily expectations. Sometimes, workers brought their own provisions, a chunk of cheese, a hard egg, or a dried apple, but many could not afford such extras. Their wages, if they had any, were meager, Payment often came in the form of shelter, not coin. And food, they were told, was part of the bargain. Yet what they received hardly nourished the bodies that toil from dark to dark. On fasting days, when the entire castle observed religious restrictions, even these scraps grew scarcer. Meals turned to little more than gruel or bread without butter. Hunger gnawed quietly, a companion more constant than conversation. And yet, they carried on. They lifted. They stirred. They served. They watched the nobles dine on sweet pastries and spice wine, on roasted boar and peacock pie. They smelled the cinnamon and clove, the rosemary and thyme. And then they returned to their own bowls, plain, pale, and half-filled. The hunger did not roar. It crept. It dulled the mind. It slowed the hands. It became the quiet hum beneath every task, the echo in every hallway, in a place where food was celebrated, photographed and painted tapestries, praise and song and story. Most of those who made it lived in want of it. The castle fed its own walls better than it fed its workers. Let us now move closer to the very space they inhabited. The kitchens and corridors where filth gathered and sickness took root. Within the vast kitchens of the medieval castle, surrounded by abundance, the staff existed in a kind of culinary shadow. What they prepared was extravagant. What they ate was not. A typical servant's meal was humble to the point of invisibility. The bread, coarse, dark, made of rye or barley, was dense and heavy, with a bitter tang from unrefined grains. It often grew hard by the second day, and even then it was rationed, sliced thin, and handed out without butter or salt. The cabbage, a staple of the lower table, was usually boiled to mush, its leaves pale and stringy, swimming in water more than broth. Its flavor, if it had any, was muted, resigned, the taste of necessity, not choice. The broth itself was more water than substance, a cloudy infusion of bones boiled for hours after they had already been stripped of meat for the Lord's table. A few carrot ends, onion skins, or turnip trimmings might be added, but there was little to nourish and less to savor. If fat floated to the surface, it was skimmed away for reuse. Richness was reserved. The portions were small. One ladle of broth, one piece of bread, a scoop of cabbage if available. If one worked in a lesser role, cleaning the halls, fetching water, mending linens, there might be even less. There were no seconds. Hunger was expected. It was part of the atmosphere. And yet, the kitchen was alive with smell. Roasted duck, glazed with honey and herbs, almond milk sauces, meat pies studded with raisins and spiced with cloves, sweet custards, crusted tarts. These passed under the noses of those who would never taste them. The juxtaposition was constant and cruel, a sensory parade of luxury, watched in silence by those whose meals could not be more plain. There were rules about what could be consumed and by whom. Stealing from the kitchen, even a scrap, was met with harsh punishment. Some staff whispered of those caught pilfering a bite of meat, only to be flogged or dismissed. Hunger was no defense. During feast days, the contrast deepened. While guests dined on 7 courses, the workers waited. Only when every plate had been cleared, when bones and rinds and sauce-slick trenchers returned to the kitchen, could the staff eat, if anything remained. Often, they dined standing, in haste, using the same utensils from earlier tasks. There was no decorum, no pause, just a chance to quiet the growling belly before the next task began. Fasting days, too, brought hardship. Though nobles might fast with rich fish dishes or spiced beans, the servants' options dwindled further, often plain bread, boiled water, or nothing at all. The spiritual value of fasting lost its nobility when it was indistinguishable from daily life. And despite this, they worked. They lifted and stirred, scrubbed and served. Their backs bent, their feet blistered, their stomachs, empty more often than not, bore the weight of a system designed to overlook them. The food they were given was not meant to satisfy. It was meant to sustain, barely, just enough to keep hands moving and silence maintained. They were fed for function, not for comfort, not for celebration. There were no recipes for servant meals, no records of seasoning, no scribes to capture their preparation. And yet, in their simplicity, these meals spoke volumes. They told a caste kept just above collapse, of hunger as a tool of control, of labor paid in crumbs. Let us now move closer to the very space they inhabited. The kitchens and corridors where filth gathered and sickness took root. Asterisk. In the medieval castle kitchen, the air was heavy with the mingled aromas of roasted meat, bubbling sauces, and spiced desserts. There was no shortage of food being prepared. Indeed, some of the finest meals in the realm were conceived here, and yet those responsible for creating them were among the hungriest in the building. Kitchen servants lived a paradox. They were surrounded by plenty, yet touched little of it. Their hands shaped meat pies, turned skewers of venison over flame, and sprinkled rare imported spices over golden pastries, only to serve them with lowered eyes, knowing the scent alone would be the closest they ever came to tasting such richness. The hierarchy of the kitchen was strict. At the top, the master cook or head chef might receive a portion from the Lord's table, though never equal to what the nobility consumed. Below him, assistants, scullions, and errand boys were far removed from such favors. Their meals, if granted at all, were drawn from the remnants. Crust too hard for noble mouths, gravy scraped from serving dishes, bones with sliver or two of meat clinging to them. Sometimes they were allowed to eat after the meal, sometimes only much later, when the heat had died down and the last of the platters were scraped clean. Cold offal, dry bread, wilted greens. This was a bounty for those who spent hours turning boar over spit, and it was never promised. A misstep or a sour look from a superior could mean going without. The air in the kitchen itself could deceive the senses. The scent of rosemary and roasting fat promised fullness, but hunger gnawed quietly behind every breath. There were moments when cooks would pause for just a second, feeling their stomach twist with want. They could taste the food only in memory or in imagination. Some servants tried to sneak bites, an olive fallen from a platter, a spoonful of broth quickly slurped before serving. But these risks could bring punishment. Theft, even of crumbs, was not taken lightly in households concerned with appearances. A watchful steward, a suspicious overseer, and even a fellow servant could ruin that brief indulgence. The physical toll of kitchen work amplified this quiet hunger. Heat pressed against the skin from the moment the hearths were lit. Fires needed constant feeding, and in summer months the air became stifling with little relief. In such conditions, energy burned quickly, yet meals remained small, inadequate to replenish what was lost through sweat and strain. Roasts turned slowly over fire, basted with dripping fat. Pastries were glazed, cooled, and carried upstairs in careful procession. Butter was churned by hand. Eels were skinned with swift, practiced motion. Cakes were layered, meat minced, and ale poured hour after hour, day after day. During grand banquets, the weight of inequality settled like smoke. Nobles dined in brightly lit halls on soft cushions, wiping their fingers on embroidered cloth, reaching for honeyed almonds and candied fruits. Below, the cooks labored in dim warmth and hard stone. Their music was not the harp, but the clang of iron pots. Their feast was not served on silver, but perhaps from a chipped bowl in the corner. Even when a small portion was allowed to the cook, it was never equal in quality or freshness. Trimmings, skins, and unappetizing leftovers made up the bulk of what was shared. The servants knew every flavor intimately, yet tasted little. They knew when a sauce was over-reduced. The contrast was most apparent when guests sang praises for the dishes. A marvel of flavor, they might say, truly fit for a king. The nobleman would nod in approval, perhaps offer a toast to his chef. Yet that toast rarely echoed past the corridor. It remained trapped in the hall, never reaching the servants' quarters. The name behind the meal, if remembered at all, was the Lord's, not the hand that stirred the pot. And in winter, when food stores ran thin and game was scarce, the divide grew sharper. The noble table still managed warm pies and preserved meats. The kitchen staff relied more heavily on turnips, porridge, and whatever could be spared. Hunger deepened. Bones grew sharper beneath tired skin. Still, the meals went on. Even in the world of food, a symbol of celebration and connection, the servants remained unseen. Their hunger was not just physical. It was a hunger of erasure, of labor done without acknowledgement, of skill practiced without reward. It was the quiet ache of those who gave joy through food but received none of it. Let us now explore how that hunger was amplified by the brutal physical demands of their daily tasks. Imagine beginning your day not with a stretch or a yawn, but with the weight of the world already upon your shoulders, quite literally. For many castle servants, especially the lower-ranking men and boys, the day started with hauling water from the well, hauling firewood up stone staircases, hauling sacks of grain from the cellar, hauling dirty laundry to the stream. The rhythm of their lives was one of burden, repetition, and sweat. These tasks, though seemingly simple, were exhausting beyond modern reckoning. There were no wheelbarrows for every job, no mechanical lifts, no carts on every floor. Everything moved by muscle, human backs, arms, and legs. Water for the kitchens and bathhouses had to be fetched daily, sometimes dozens of times, in heavy buckets. A single-filled bucket of water could weigh 30 to 40 pounds. It wasn't uncommon to carry up several flights of spiral stairs. The stone steps were worn smooth and slick with use, treacherous underfoot, especially in winter. Firewood was equally vital. Every room needed its own fire during colder months, though the servant quarters rarely received such luxury. But it was the job of those same servants to ensure the noble chambers remained warm. Logs were not neatly stacked outside every door. They had to be gathered, chopped, dried, and carried by hand through courtyards, corridors, and across battlements, sometimes in sleet or mud. Every fire that crackled in a noblewoman's sitting room had been kindled with sweat and splinters. Supply hauling did not end there. Grain and flour, meat and fish, oil and vinegar, all of it had to be moved from storerooms to kitchens, then again from kitchens to halls. Wet barrels, crates of poultry, cheese wheels wrapped in cloth, salt sacks. The physicality of running a castle was a quiet storm, endured each day by those never seen at the feast. Yet, despite the ceaseless energy expenditure, nutrition was scant. The meals described in the previous chapter, scraps, broth, coarse bread, offered only partial replenishment. Caloric deficiency was constant. Servants were, in many ways, running a long-distance race each day with no water stations, no finish line, and shoes made of wood or poorly mended leather. Their clothing was not suited for physical labor. Tunics chafed, shoes rubbed raw, shoulders ached without relief. The burden grew heavier as the day wore on, and yet one could not stop to rest. One could not ask for mercy. The rhythm of the castle was relentless. Fires went out. Kitchens demanded water. Guests required service. There was always more to lift, more to carry, more to move. Even young children were pulled into this cycle. A boy of 10 might be sent to carry firewood for hours. A girl might be expected to haul heavy baskets of linen. Growth was stunted. Bones grew brittle. Muscles hardened young and bodies aged early. By the time many castle servants reached 30, they bore the weariness of 60 years. Servants developed techniques, balancing loads on backs or using shoulder poles when possible. But injuries were common. Twisted ankles on cobblestones, bruised knees from collapsed sacks, hernias, sprains. And because most injuries were treated with superstition or neglect, many were left to heal poorly or not at all. The rhythm did not pause for pain. Those tasked with physical labor also endured psychological weight. The strain was not just on the body, but on the mind. A nobleman might complain of a lukewarm bath, never knowing it was delayed because a bucket slipped from frozen hands. A lady might sneer at a servant who smelled of sweat, forgetting that the scent came from lighting the very fire that warmed her tea. Their work was not seen as skill, but obligation. Yet it required more endurance, precision, and foresight than most tasks inside those castle walls. A dropped crate of eggs could earn a beating. A mislaid sack of flour could spoil a feast. And still, the servant's name was unknown. There were no holidays from hauling. Even religious festivals required extra effort. More fires, more food, more movement. In times of war, the labor doubled. Stones had to be moved, gates reinforced, weapons transported, horses cared for. When siege came, it was these same men and women who fortified the inside, moving water barrels and storing rations, still working with hollow stomachs. And so, as the day faded and the castle quieted, one could imagine a servant slipping into a corner, sitting for the first time since dawn, legs trembling, arms sore, stomach hollow, not with pride, but with a kind of empty perseverance. They would eat what was left, if anything, and rise again the next day to do the same. The weight they bore was not just physical. It was a weight of invisibility, the burden of being essential yet forgotten. Let us now turn to the broader rituals of food. How these same laborers watched as the fruits of their efforts adorned noble tables, even as their own plates remained bare. In a medieval castle, scarcity was not an occasional hardship. It was a rhythm of life. Even in times of relative peace, food security was fragile. Fields were unpredictable. Grain could rot. Floods could spoil storage, and a late frost could ruin a whole season's yield. But beyond the natural threats to food supply, there were also man-made constraints. The fasting calendar imposed by the church, the uneven distribution of provisions within the castle, and the preference of the elite to store surplus rather than share it. For the lowliest workers in the castle, the kitchen hands, the laundry girls, the stable boys, food was never guaranteed, even on days when the larders seemed full. During official fasts, meat and dairy were forbidden, but this did not mean that the rich stopped eating. Instead, nobles simply replaced meat with elaborate fish dishes, imported almonds and egg substitutes whipped into cakes. Their chefs labored to create opulence out of restriction. But for those at the bottom, fasting days were not a change in menu. They were a deepening of hunger. What little scraps were handed down vanished during these times. A bowl of broth without fat, bread with no lard, vegetables boiled to mush. Days that were already meager became bleak. The church expected piety, but hunger does not recognize holiness. And then came the lean seasons, the weeks or months when the granaries grew bare, and preserved food had run low. Springtime was especially cruel, known as a hungry gap. It marked the end of winter stores, but preceded the year's first harvests. In these weeks, meals shrank to nearly nothing. Coarse bread made from peas or acorns, weak beer, fermented cabbage, perhaps a pickled herring, if one was lucky. Food shortages were exacerbated by the castle's hierarchy. The best and safest food was always reserved for the lord and his family, followed by his retinue, then the skilled tradesmen, and finally the general servants. By the time bread and cheese reached the lowest ranks, it was often stale, moldy, or infested. Still, it was eaten because it had to be. During times of famine or siege, the inequity grew sharper. When outside threats closed in, the castle would be stocked and locked. Nobles made plans, stored grain, dried meat. Servants hauled barrels of salted fish, but knew they might never taste it. Rations were distributed, but not evenly. A noble might still enjoy a roast or pudding while a servant subsisted on gruel. And always, there were mouths not fed at all, children dismissed to beg, elders too weak to be useful. Hunger was more than a physical sensation. It altered perception. It slowed thought. It frayed tempers and quieted joy. A hungry servant became a shadow of themselves, moving slowly, speaking little, focusing only on the next task, the next chance to eat. Even dreams were touched by hunger. Bread and apples, butter on barley, a stew thick with meat. These became the longings whispered into straw mattresses. The psychological toll of hunger compounded the physical one. To be hungry while cooking for others was a special torment. To lift a tray of honey tarts and know you would never taste one. To pour wine for a guest and smell its richness, only to return to sour ale. And always the rules of silence. To voice your hunger was to risk reprimand or ridicule. Better to swallow the ache. Some tried to steal food, but the punishment for theft was severe. A missing apple could mean a whipping. A piece of cheese tucked beneath a tunic could cost a position. So most did not steal. They endured. On rare feast days, a servant might receive a token extra, a small pie, a mug of fresh ale. But even these were reminders of what they lacked every other day. The joy was real, but brief. The next morning began again with cold bread and aching limbs. And yet, somehow they survived. Bones grew thin, but not all broke. Children learned to eat slowly, to chew every mouthful, to hide food for later. Women learned which herbs quieted the belly. Men learned to wait until the halls quieted before slipping to the kitchen, hoping for a crust. The rhythm of hunger was not just daily, it was lifelong. Most castle servants were born into poverty and would die in it. Their entire existence danced to the availability of food. How much, how clean, how old, how long until more. As we reflect on these fasting days and hungry nights, it becomes clear hunger was not an exception in the medieval castle. It was companion, a shadow, a thread woven through every corner of daily life. And through it all, the servants worked. Let us now explore the final hardship in this chapter. Malnutrition, exhaustion, the toll of relentless underfeeding, and overworking that left bodies broken long before their time. To be a servant in a medieval castle was not simply to live in hardship, but to carry that hardship in one's bones. The steady erosion of strength, the dull ache that settled deep in the muscles and never fully faded. This was a quiet legacy of malnutrition and exhaustion. Malnutrition was rarely dramatic. It did not always look like starvation. Instead, it was a slow unraveling. A servant might eat something each day, a bowl of porridge, a heel of bread, a few spoonfuls of stew, but not enough to sustain the energy spent. The body began to prioritize. Skin thinned, hair dulled, teeth loosened, cuts healed slowly if at all. Cold lingered in the fingertips, and tremors appeared by dusk. Even the mind grew foggy, especially late in the day, when weariness blurred the line between waking and sleeping. Children suffered most visibly. Stunted growth was common. A boy of 12 might appear 8. A girl might begin work as a laundress with hands already red and cracked. Rickets twisted legs. Scurvy loosened teeth. But there was no physician for the poor, no knowledge of vitamins or minerals, just a vague sense that the food they ate lacked something essential. Grandmothers might whisper old remedies, nettles for strength, garlic to purify the blood, but these were faint candles against a long night of deficiency. And still, the work continued. Servants carried loads they were not strong enough to bear. They woke before they had fully rested. They knelt for hours scrubbing stone floors, with backs already bowed. There were no rest days. There were no sabbaticals. The very concept of recovery was foreign. If you could walk, you worked. If you could stand, you carried. If you could bend, you cleaned. Fatigue was constant. It clouded thought, dulled conversation, made the body clumsy and the spirit still. It crept into joints and whispered reminders each morning. The first steps out of a straw bed were often the hardest, not just for pain, but for the weight of repetition. There would be no relief, not today, perhaps not ever. Sleep itself was not restorative. Many servants shared cramped, unheated quarters. Beds were little more than straw, sometimes shared between 2 or more people. Lice, fleas, and cold made restful sleep a rarity. A child might wake from a nightmare only to find her legs numb from cold. A man might cough through the night, lungs raw from mold and ash. Others found themselves dreaming of food, pies and honey, meat so tender dissolved in the mouth, only to wake hungry once again. Obedience was expected even in illness. A servant to be pale, dizzy, even feverish, but if he could move, he was expected to perform his duties. To speak of pain was often seen as weakness or defiance, and so most said nothing. They pushed through headaches, muscle aches, fatigue. They worked with burning throats, with chapped skin, with aching joints. Silence became armor. Stillness became survival. And if one collapsed, there was little ceremony. Another would take their place. A child, perhaps, or an elder drawn back into labor. The work never stopped. It waited for no one. Even death was no interruption, just a shift change. Over time, exhaustion reshaped the body. Shoulders curled, hands gnarled, eyes dimmed, and because there was no mirror, no portrait, the servants themselves often forgot what they once looked like. They became part of the stone and smoke of the castle. Always moving, always doing, never fully seen. Each movement left a mark, but no one remembered who had made it. Their silence was not born of submission alone. It was a silence of survival. Speaking required energy. Complaining risked punishment. And so, they learned to work through the ache, to nod when addressed, to move without question. They became efficient, but not whole. Even smiles were rationed, save for rare moments of safety. The toll of this exhaustion extended into the soul. It dulled laughter. It made joy seem indulgent. The sound of music in the great hall could feel like a memory from another life. Even small pleasures, sunlight in a courtyard, the scent of rosemary, were fleeting, drowned beneath fatigue. A joke might pass between servants in the scullery, but it faded quickly. There was always another pot to scrub, another burden to carry. But they endured, not because of strength alone, but because there was no alternative. No escape, no future promise of relief. To be a castle servant was to live in service until death, or until the body gave out. Some were lucky enough to marry and leave service. Others aged into roles with slightly less strain. But most stayed, wearing themselves away in the same corridors they first walked as children. And many bodies did, collapsing beside the hearth, fainting in the stables, dying of simple infections, being replaced, unnamed, unremembered. The rhythm never faltered. The names changed, but the work remained. This is a final truth of their daily hunger and effort. They gave more than they ever received. And in doing so, they kept the castle alive. Their exhaustion was not weakness. It was testimony. Their silence was not absence. It was a sacrifice. Let us now gently leave this world of toil and turn to another kind of silence. The silence enforced not by hunger, but by power. In the next chapter, we will explore how most castle workers were expected to be invisible. Their voices stilled even as they held up the very foundations of noble life. Chapter 3. Filth in every corner. Imagine walking through a castle corridor before sunrise, carrying a flickering lantern. The flagstones beneath your feet are uneven and cold. There is no breeze, no birdsong, only a pungent heaviness in the air that clings to the walls and settles in your throat. This is not incense or smoke from the kitchen hearth. It is a stench of human waste, of chamber pots emptied too close to where people live, of cesspits too full to hold another drop. In the medieval castle, plumbing as we know it did not exist. Water came from wells and rain barrels, and waste had to be moved by hand. Every chamber, from noble bedrooms to servant dormitories, relied on pots, ceramic or wooden vessels used throughout the day and night to collect what the body discarded. When full, these pots had to be carried out and emptied, often by the same people who had filled them. And where did it all go? Into deep pits dug near the outer walls, into trenches that sloped downhill, or, in many castles, into the moat itself. A moat might look romantic in paintings, a mirror of the sky, a quiet ribbon encircling stone walls. But in truth, it was often a sewer, a still, murky body of water that carried the refuse of hundreds of people. Human waste, rotting food, animal remains. The smell in summer was nearly unbearable, especially for those whose tasks kept them near the lower grounds, scullery maids, stable hands, and guards. In dry seasons, when water levels dropped, the waste congealed and cracked underfoot. In floods, it seeped into walkways and storerooms. The moat gave nothing back but disease. And yet, people continued to live and work beside it. There was no choice. The waste had to go somewhere, and the moat was already there. The servants who bore the burden of this disposal did so with little protection. No gloves, no masks, just cloth wrappings over their mouths, or nothing at all. They learned to breathe through their mouths. They learned to scrub their hands with ashes or sharp sand. If their tunics grew stiff with stains, there was little they could do. Soap was scarce. Hot water even scarcer. Within the castle itself, there were a few garderobes, essentially medieval toilets built into the walls, with a chute leading outside. These were used by the upper classes, though even they were far from sanitary. Waste would pile at the base of these shafts or trickle into the same moat where chamber pots were emptied. The odor seeped into stone. It clung to walls. In winter, it froze into stiff, reeking icicles. In summer, it swelled and buzzed with flies. Even when waste was disposed of carefully, the sheer volume was overwhelming. A castle might house several hundred people at a time, residents, servants, guests, soldiers. Every one of them used the chamber pot. Every one of them contributed to the smell that lived in every corridor and stairwell. The scent of waste became as common as that of wood smoke or damp straw. People grew used to it. That was perhaps the saddest truth. The consequences were not just olfactory. Waste attracted flies and rats. It carried disease. The water sources near castles were often contaminated, and outbreaks of dysentery or intestinal illness were common. Those who worked closest to the waste, the night soil carriers, the cleaners, the lowest of the low, paid the greatest price. Their lungs suffered. Their stomachs churned. Many died young. Children sent to help their parents in this work were rarely strong enough to last more than a few years. And yet, these jobs were vital. Without them, the castle would have become unlivable. So these invisible laborers toiled in silence, rising before dawn to collect the pots, hauling them down back staircases, praying the contents didn't spill on their clothing. Sometimes accidents did happen. A servant might trip in the dark and fall. Another might be splashed by wind or misstep. There was no spare tunic waiting. One simply wiped it away and moved on. Sometimes the air was so heavy with waste that it seemed to sit on the tongue. Nobles rarely noticed. The work was done out of sight. The waste disappeared like magic, but the smell lingered. It crept into tapestries. It embedded itself in rushes strewn on the floor. It turned each draft of wind into a gamble. Visitors from other lands sometimes remarked on it, carefully, cautiously, but those who lived there simply shrugged. The castle, after all, was a place of stone, sweat, smoke, and rot. It was not meant to be fragrant, and so the castle, for all its splendor, was never truly clean. Behind the banners and braziers, there was always rot. Behind the velvet curtains, the quiet knowledge that somewhere, just out of sight, waste was being carried by tired hands. The filth was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. The castle kitchen, with its vast fireplaces and rows of wooden tables, might sound like a place of warmth and abundance. Indeed, this was where roasted meats crackled, where bread rose in soot-darkened ovens, where vegetables from the gardens were peeled and chopped and simmered into stew. Yet for all its motion and scent, the kitchen was also a haven for creatures that did not belong. Mice, rats, flies, and beetles who crept and crawled unseen until the moment they spoiled the food or startled a servant. The warmth of the kitchens attracted them. So did the food. Stored grain in sacks, meat hanging from rafters, crumbs left under the table legs. The storerooms were little better, though lined with barrels and shelves. They were rarely sealed tightly enough to keep pests out. Gaps between floorboards, holes behind stonework, loose lids. Every flaw was an open invitation. Damp air and the scent of ripening stores created a perfect breeding ground for insects whose names no one recorded, but whose presence was well known. Rats scurried to the rafters at night, their nails clicking faintly on the wooden beams. They gnawed through sacks and nibbled cheeses left to age. Their droppings, though small, were ever present, mixed with dust in corners, hidden under straw mats. Servants stepped over them as though stepping over spilled salt. At times, a servant might lift a loaf and find bite marks across the crust. And yet, the food could not be discarded. It was scraped, brushed, and served. Sometimes, even in nobles, there were no alternatives. Flies were worse in summer. Drawn by blood and grease, they clustered around roasting spits and soup kettles. They laid eggs and spoiled meat. They buzzed around open windows and nested in folds of cloth. Their wings hummed above every dish, their legs tapping across cuts of pork or fowl. Some servants tried to shoo them with bundles of herbs or strips of cloth nailed to sticks. Others ignored them. One could not spend the day waving flies away. There was too much to do, and too little time. Beetles and weevils infested grain supplies. At first, they were invisible, tiny black specks, no bigger than crumbs. But over time, their presence grew undeniable. Flour smelled wrong. Barley shifted strangely in the sack. Still, the grain was used. It had to be. There were mouths to feed, and not enough clean stores to be selective. If the infestation was not too great, it was ignored. If it was worse, the top layer might be removed, and the rest used anyway. Waste was a luxury only the nobility could afford. The servants who worked in these spaces learned to move quickly and not look too closely. They washed their hands when they could. They tied up their hair. They scraped and scrubbed and swept, but the pests always returned. They came with the rain. They came with the warmth. They came through cracks in the walls and holes in the roof. The castle was not airtight. It was a living, breathing structure, one that breathed in pests with every change of season. One might say the walls themselves sighed under the burden of their infestation. Cats were sometimes kept in the kitchens and storerooms, and they were praised for their hunting. A good mouser was more valuable than a broom. But even cats could not stem the tide. Rats bred faster than they could be caught. In the darkest corners, behind barrels, or deep in the cellars, they thrived. There were stories of cats growing wary of certain spaces, refusing to enter them. Places where rats moved in groups, where their eyes glinted like tiny lanterns in the shadows. And so every meal was prepared in the company of vermin. Every bag of grain was suspect. Every cut of meat a gamble. The servants, already overworked and underfed, became indifferent. They picked out the worst of the maggots. They sliced away the rot. They stirred and salted and served, and hoped no one would notice. Or if they didn't notice, that they would blame the cook and not the conditions. A clever hand could disguise much with enough pepper, enough vinegar, and if the taste lingered oddly, well, so did many things in castles. This quiet infestation was rarely mentioned in records. No chronicler detailed the fly eggs in the butter, the mouse nest in the flour bin. But it was there. It was part of the rhythm. It was as normal as dawn bread and dusk stew. The castle may have been a seat of power, but at its base, it was always shared with creatures that knew nothing of nobility. The feast may have been planned by lords, but it was shaped quietly, invisibly, by paws and wings, mandibles and tiny legs. They too had a place at the table, if only at the corners. Within the thick walls of the medieval castle, waste, both organic and human, found no convenient exit. There was no organized sanitation system, no dedicated corps of street sweepers or municipal collectors. The labor of cleaning fell to the same individuals who toiled through kitchens and sculleries, stable yards and servant halls, often the youngest, poorest, and least visible of the castle's population. And even then, there was only so much they could do. Imagine the far end of a hallway, where a torchlight barely reached and the air grew thick and stale. Here, behind a heavy wooden door warped with damp, lay one of many storage niches. Too small for regular use, too inconvenient for the bustle of everyday life. It was in places like these that rot gathered quietly and persistently. Leftover vegetable peelings, crusts of bread, cracked eggshells, and spoiled meat that even the dogs would not eat. In theory, all kitchen scraps would be dumped outside in pits or composted behind the kitchen gardens. But theory often failed beneath the weight of exhaustion. And so, servants might deposit refuse in the nearest and used space, promising themselves they'd return later. Often they didn't. In the same way, chamber pots, those simple vessels of daily necessity, were sometimes left full beside doors, tucked under furniture, or hidden behind curtains in moments of haste. A missed trip to the cesspit, a distraction during feast preparation, a forgotten task after a sleepless night. And suddenly, waste lingered where it ought not to. It only took a few hours before the smell announced its presence. But by then, everyone was busy with the next task. The rhythm of castle life moved forward. Even as the waste stood still, corridors that were rarely used became repositories for unwanted items. A broken stool, a leaking bucket, a bloodied cloth from the last hunt. Food waste and bodily refuse mingled with dust and straw. Mold grew along the edges of stone. Fungus sprouted in forgotten crevices. The walls themselves, porous and cool, absorbed the scent of these things, exhaling it when the air turned damp. Servants tasked with cleaning these spaces did so with whatever tools were at hand. Mops made of bundled rags, brooms of bound twigs, or simply bare hands and a cloth. There were no antiseptics, no soap as we know it, no rubber gloves. Ashes from the hearth were sometimes used to scrub stains. Strong vinegar was reserved for the table, not for floors. If a mess soaked into wood or stone, it was left to dry and flake away over time. Cleanliness was judged by smell and appearance, not by sanitation. The problem was compounded by the castle's structure. Drainage was poor. Floors often sloped inward rather than out, trapping liquids. Rain leaked through roofs and trickled down inner walls. Cellars, especially, were prone to flooding, and in the absence of a proper drainage system, water mixed with animal dung, kitchen grease, and decaying matter. Buckets were carried again and again to scoop it out, but it returned with the next storm. Pests, already thriving as described in the last argument, found these forgotten corners ideal for nesting. Maggots hatched in meat scraps. Flies congregated on blood-soaked rushes. Rats gnawed on bones and bred in shadowy nests lined with rags and straw. In some parts of the castle, the smell of rot was so persistent that tapestries were hung not for decoration, but to mask it. Sometimes even that was not enough. Noble families rarely ventured into these parts of their own homes. Their world was built atop the labor of others, sanitized not in fact, but in perception. They walked halls swept before their arrival. They dined in chambers perfumed with herbs. They slept in rooms whose hearths burned bright enough to mask all other smells. But the truth was never far away. Beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, in the narrow crawl spaces and disused stairwells, the waste remained. And with it came illness, not in the immediate, violent fashion of battlefield wounds, but in the slow, invisible way of foul air and contaminated food. The people who cleaned these corners often felt ill themselves. They coughed more in winter. They developed rashes, sores, and fevers. Children raised in servant quarters had stomachs hardened by exposure, or else they did not survive past infancy. The connection between waste and disease was not yet known, but those who lived nearest the filth understood its effect. There were attempts to maintain order. Rules were posted for kitchen staff. Scullions were assigned specific duties for disposal. But rules only worked when there was time and energy to follow them. And energy, in the castle's lower ranks, was always in short supply. During festivals or times of siege, waste piled faster than it could be moved. The castle's hidden spaces became choking with decay. The scent of damp bread crust and spoiled wine, of old sweat and chamber pots, was simply part of the air. It was inhaled without thought. Yet, even in this reality, there were rhythms and rituals. Herbs were scattered on floors to be trampled underfoot, releasing a faint sweetness to disguise the rot. Rushes were changed when possible. Clothes were aired on rare sunny days. A clean apron or headcloth brought a sense of pride, no matter how temporary. People endured. They adapted. They learned which corners to avoid, which boards creaked near foul puddles, which servants were careful, and which let things fester. In the end, the castle was not a place of pristine grandeur. It was layered, stone over dirt, beauty over stench, order over the endless, quiet presence of decay. And so long as waste found places to hide, it shaped the lives of everyone within, from the youngest scullion to the oldest knight. In the imagined grandeur of medieval castle, one might assume that its lords and ladies, or even the servants who tended to their daily needs, had access to the kind of bathing rituals seen in later centuries or different cultures. But the truth was far more stagnant. Bathing, that simple act of cleansing the body with warm water and gentle soap, was anything but routine. In fact, within the damp stone corridors of castle life, it was rare, discouraged, and occasionally even feared. First, there was the issue of water, both its availability and its condition. Water had to be fetched, often by hand, from wells or nearby streams. In times of peace, this might mean several heavy bucket trips a day. In times of siege or drought, water became precious, reserved for drinking, cooking, or dousing fires. The idea of filling an entire wooden tub just to sit in it was a luxury few could justify. Even noble families found frequent bathing wasteful. When water was available, it was rarely clean. Wells within the castle walls were often shallow or tainted by runoff from nearby cesspits, kitchen refuse, or animal stalls. Surface water from ponds or streams carried silt, insect larvae, and animal waste. It might look clear enough in the bucket, but by the time it filled a bath, it brought with it the earthy smell of stagnation. Heating the water was another labor-intensive task, requiring firewood, time, and attention from the kitchen staff. As a result, full-body bathing was a rare event. Most people practiced spot cleaning, a cloth dipped in warm water wiped across the face, hands, and perhaps under the arms. Feet, often callous and perpetually dirty, might be soaked in winter, but rarely scrubbed. Hair was brushed and occasionally rinsed, but seldom washed. Even among nobility, complete immersion was seen as unnecessary, and by some, even dangerous. This belief was not based purely on inconvenience. Medieval medical theory, drawn largely from ancient Greek and Roman sources and preserved through early Christian scholarship, emphasized the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a balance between these fluids, and any activity that opened the body, be it sweating, bloodletting, or bathing, was thought to risk upsetting that balance. Warm water, in particular, was thought to open the pores, allowing disease to enter the body. Cold water, on the other hand, could chill the blood and cause illness. For many, staying dry and tightly clothed was a better safeguard. Because of this, bathing often occurred only during special occasions, before a wedding, during certain religious festivals, or after recovering from illness. Even then, it was not always private. Communal bathhouses existed in some towns and cities, but castles were isolated by design. A large wooden tub might be set up in a kitchen or warm room, and one person at a time would bathe, with the same water used repeatedly. Modesty was flexible. Cleanliness was relative. To compensate for the lack of bathing, people used other means to mask or control odor. Linen undergarments were worn beneath woolen outerwear and were changed more frequently, as linen absorbed sweat and oils. Herbs such as lavender, rosemary, or thyme were tucked into belts, sewn into clothing, or strewn on the floors. Noble women sometimes carried small pomanders, scented balls of wax or herbs, tied to their wrists or belts, which they could snip discreetly when unpleasant odors lingered nearby. Servants had fewer options. Their clothes were washed infrequently and aired when the weather allowed. Shared bedding, straw mattresses, and close quarters made it difficult to remain clean even when one tried. Insects such as lice and fleas thrived in unwashed hair and fabric, and the constant scratching was simply accepted as part of life. Yet, it would be wrong to say medieval people were ignorant or indifferent to hygiene. They understood the value of cleanliness, even if they defined it differently. They rinsed their hands before meals, cleaned wounds when injured, and maintained rituals of spiritual and symbolic purification. They used scented waters, ashes, or vinegar for rubbing the skin. They swept floors, scrubbed tables, and polished armor. But their concept of a clean body did not rely on regular washing. Bathing also served as a rare social ritual in some circles. A shared tub, when it appeared, might be used by multiple family members in order of seniority or status. Water would be reused, which made early bathers the most fortunate. These moments, though humble by modern standards, could offer a brief escape from the grime of the day. Fleeting comfort in warm water, steam curling in the corners of a cold room, the faint scent of thyme or pine drifting in from herbs added to the bath. There were also spiritual associations with cleanliness. Pilgrims, for instance, often performed ritual washings before visiting sacred sites. Monasteries had strict hand-washing routines before prayer or meals. These acts did not substitute for full bathing, but they reflected a consciousness around purity, physical, moral, and ceremonial. Nonetheless, myths and fears persisted. Bathing too often was believed to weaken the body, leaving it vulnerable. Stories spread of people falling ill shortly after a bath, especially in winter, reinforcing belief that it was the water, not the disease, to blame. It would take centuries and significant shifts in medical understanding before bathing became a widespread and trusted practice again. And so, the air of the castle held many layers of roasting meat, damp stone, musty tapestries, and bodies only partially cleaned. It was not filth by their standards. It was simply the scent of living, woven into the fabric of daily survival. Within the cold and shadowy confines of a medieval castle, cleanliness was more of a concept than a consistent reality. Even if the people who lived and worked there understood the discomforts of filth, they were often powerless to change the rhythms of their environment. One of the most persistent and inescapable discomforts of castle life was the infestation of lice and fleas. Tiny invaders that made their homes in unwashed clothing and bedding, thriving in the folds of fabric and seams of straw. Clothing, for most people, was not something to be changed daily. A peasant or a servant might have only 1 or 2 garments for working, and perhaps one more for Sunday or feast days. These garments were made to last and were patched, mended, and handed down over years. The materials, coarse wool, linen, or homespun fabrics, were durable but absorbed sweat, oil, smoke, and dust with stubborn persistence. Washing them was a laborious task. It required hauling water, building fires, making soap or acquiring ashes, and scrubbing garments by hand before hanging them to dry. And so, clothing was worn again and again, often until it stood on its own from stiffness or stink. Servants, cooks, grooms, and guards all shared small spaces, worked long hours, and sweated daily. Their garments clung to them like a second skin, trapping warmth, moisture, and the microscopic life that came with it. Lice thrived in such conditions. Body lice preferred the seams and folds of clothing, laying eggs, nits, that clung to fibers like tiny grains of rice. Once infested, a garment could only be truly cleaned by boiling, something rarely possible in a castle kitchen busy preparing food. Head lice settled into hair, especially among children or those who shared combs, head coverings, or pillows. It was not uncommon to see people scratching their scalps absently or delousing each other by firelight, pinching insect between their fingernails and dropping them into the flames. Fleas were more opportunistic. Carried by rats, pets, or livestock, they jumped from bedding to tunic to sock with impressive agility. A single flea could bite dozens of times, leaving red welts that itched for days. In the still of the night, servants sleeping on straw pallets or woolen blankets would shift and murmur, plagued by invisible tormentors. Yet this too was normal. Everyone scratched. Everyone bore the marks. It was part of castle life. Bedding was no refuge. Even the noble classes with feather-filled mattresses and embroidered sheets were not spared. These beds were often rarely aired or laundered, as removing and washing such heavy items required staff, space, and time. Straw mattresses, used by most castle workers, were infrequently changed. Over time, the straw broke down, growing damp, moldy, or infested with pests. A servant might plump it by hand or add fresh hay to the top, but the core remained unchanged for years. Blankets and cloaks were shared, passed between members of the household or guests. Children slept beside parents. Pages bunked near squires, and multiple servants curled together for warmth in shared quarters. This closeness, necessary for survival, also allowed parasites to travel easily between hosts. Efforts to fight infestations were ongoing but limited. Clothes might be aired in the sun, laid out over hedges or on wooden racks when weather allowed. Some garments were beaten with sticks to shake out dust and insects. Herbal remedies were also employed. Lavender, mint, and pennyroyal were believed to repel bugs and were sewn into pockets or scattered beneath mattresses. Dogs and cats, common in castles, helped manage rodent populations but also carried fleas of their own. For the nobility, the discomfort was only slightly mitigated. They had more clothing, more bedding, and servants attend to them, but they still lived in the same stone walls, endured the same long winters, and shared the same air. Fleas and lice made no distinction between rank. Even kings were scratched. Contemporary writings rarely mention these discomforts directly. Lice and fleas were too ordinary to merit comment. Chroniclers recorded battles, alliances, births, and deaths, not the endless itching that kept a servant from restful sleep or the embarrassed scratching of a lord at court. Yet modern archaeological evidence, the combs filled with nits, the fossilized eggs and linens, the louse combs found buried with their owners, paints a quiet but persistent picture. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their thinner skin, close as animals, and shared bedding meant they often bore the brunt of infestations. And with infestations came secondary infections, bites that festered, sores that spread, and illnesses carried by parasites. Typhus, transmitted by body lice, was one such danger. Though misunderstood at the time, its outbreaks sometimes devastated communities within and beyond castle walls. Still, life continued. It had to. People scratched, whispered, picked, and patted down sleeves. They deloused by hearthlight and changed straw when they could. It was not pleasant. It was not clean, but it was the rhythm of castle living. In the vast halls and narrow corridors of medieval castles, a quiet danger stalked the inhabitants, one that could not be seen, heard, or touched until it was too late. Disease was an ever-present threat, and the combination of close quarters, Poor sanitation and a complete lack of understanding about the nature of contagion made castles particularly vulnerable to plagues and infections. Illness swept through households not with warning, but with speed and finality. At the heart of this vulnerability lay a tragic truth. The people of the Middle Ages had no concept of germs. The idea that invisible organisms could cause sickness would not emerge until centuries later. Instead, illness was attributed to miasmas, foul airs, bad humors within the body, or divine punishment. Cures focus on balancing bodily fluids, purging sin, or sweetening the air, none of which address the true causes of transmission. In castles, where dozens or even hundreds lived and worked in close proximity, these misunderstandings created the perfect conditions for outbreaks. Kitchens, stables, halls, and servant quarters were tightly packed. People shared beds, utensils, cups, towels, and clothing. A cough, a rash, a fever. It could begin with one person and quietly thread its way through the stone walls, leaving a trail of suffering in its wake. One of the most feared diseases of the era was the plague, especially the bubonic plague that swept through Europe in waves, most infamously in the 14th century. Though rats and their fleas carried the bacterium, the residents of castles had no understanding of this link. Instead, they blamed foreign merchants, foul weather, or the wrath of God. In truth, it was the unwashed fabric, the flea-ridden animals, the overcrowded conditions, and the absence of basic cleanliness that allowed the disease to flourish. Castle inhabitants tried to protect themselves with talismans, herbs, and prayer. Rooms were fumigated with burning sage or rosemary. Straw on the floor was replaced more often. Nobles fled to countryside estates to escape the city, sometimes unknowingly bringing the infection with them. But these measures were largely symbolic. There was no true isolation, no sanitation protocols. The sick and the healthy remained together until it was clear who would survive. Even beyond the Great Plagues, everyday infections took a toll. Skin ailments spread through shared linens. Eye infections passed from child to child. Cuts, which might seem minor, often led to festering wounds. With no antiseptics, no antibiotics, and little understanding of cleanliness, even a scrape from a kitchen knife or a blister from a boot could spiral into a deadly abscess. Medical care was primitive. Barbers doubled as surgeons. Treatments included bloodletting, leeches, and poultices of questionable cleanliness. Wounds were wrapped in cloth that had not been boiled or washed. The tools used might pass from one patient to another without cleaning, and all of it was done with the best of intentions, guided by learned books, tradition, or desperate hope. Religious explanations dominated. Illness was a test of faith, a punishment for sin, or the work of malevolent spirits. People sought healing through relics, pilgrimages, or the blessing of holy men. Though these practices provided spiritual comfort, they offered little in the way of physical relief. And when someone died, their possessions might be passed along or reused without disinfection, allowing disease to persist long after the funeral bells fell silent. Among castle servants, infections spread rapidly. Their crowded quarters, shared blankets, and constant physical labor weakened their immune systems. The stress of hunger, cold, and exhaustion left little resistance. And so, a single sneeze, a fever, or an inflamed wound could set in motion a quiet wave of sickness. Children, always vulnerable, were hit hardest. Many did not survive to adulthood. A bad winter cold could turn into pneumonia. A rash might herald something more serious. Coughing fits, stomach fevers, or unexplained seizures. All of these were seen and accepted with weary resignation. Without records or diagnoses, most of these deaths pass unmarked, except by the empty space left behind. Even the nobility, with their soft beds and separate chambers, could not escape. Disease did not respect rank. Lords died of infected teeth. Ladies succumbed to fevers during childbirth. A prince could vanish from history as quickly as a stable boy, both taken by an illness whose name would never be known. And yet, the castle had to go on. Another child born, another servant hired, another prayer said by candlelight. Still, amid all of this suffering, life persisted. People learned to read the signs of illness in others. They relied on folk wisdom and midwives who knew which herbs brought comfort, if not cure. They spoke in hushed tones about who was ill and who was not. They mourned quickly and loved fiercely. And each day, they returned to the work of keeping the castle alive, sweeping, cooking, tending animals, mending clothes. The knowledge we now take for granted, hand-washing, sterilization, quarantine, was centuries away, and yet their resilience is undeniable. They lived in a world where disease was an expected part of existence. A shadow on the stairs, a cough behind the door, a silence in the next room. In the next chapter, we'll shift focus on the physical ailments of castle life to the emotional burden carried by those who lived and worked within its walls, and how silence became a way of survival. Chapter 4. No voice, just silence. Imagine a world where every breath you take is measured, where every step is watched, and your voice is not your own. Within the walls of a medieval castle, silence was not merely a choice, it was survival. Servants, who made up the bulk of the castle's population, learned from a young age that their words were not welcome unless summoned. In this deeply hierarchical world, speaking out, no matter how valid concern, could be seen not as brave or helpful, but as insolent. Servants were the invisible machinery of the castle. They lit the fires, prepared the food, emptied the chamber pots, polished armor, scrubbed floors, and fetched the endless supplies needed to keep noble life moving. Their work was foundational, but their presence was minimized. They moved through halls like shadows, often expected to bow their heads or step aside when a lord or lady passed. To speak without invitation was to risk more than reprimand. It could cost one's position, one's safety, or even one's home. This code of silence was reinforced from the very beginning. Young boys taken on as pages or girls placed as maids were taught to observe, not participate. If they noticed a noble in pain, they were to find the right superior quietly. If they saw injustice between higher-ranked servants or suspected theft, illness, or even abuse, the expectation was the same: remain quiet unless instructed otherwise. The servant's job was to serve, not to question, not to judge, and certainly not to interfere. Even in moment of crisis, when someone fell ill or collapsed, the chain of silence held strong. A cook who noticed a rash spreading on a scullion's arms might simply tell the boy to work faster. A maid who saw her mistress faint in the garden might not run to help but walk, quickly but carefully, to fetch a higher-ranking servant. A stable hand who suspected a visiting knight was drunk and dangerous might say nothing, trusting that someone else would intervene. Often no one did. It wasn't that these people were uncaring. Far from it. They formed deep bonds with one another, shared scraps of food, and helped one another with chores. But the culture of a castle drilled obedience into the very marrow of their bones. Speaking out, especially if it disrupted a noble's peace or revealed a failing within a household, was a risk not worth taking. The hierarchy within the servant class itself further enforced this silence. A low-ranking kitchen boy would not speak to the head cook without being addressed. A laundress would not approach the steward directly. Pages, squires, scullions, grooms, maids, all had their place, and speaking out of turn was an offense not just to one person, but to the system itself. The weight of silence was not only top-down, it was lateral, reinforced by peer pressure and fear. Some attempted to find their voice through writing. In the rare cases where servants were literate, they might pen quiet pleas in the margins of account books or scribble notes in personal ledgers. But even writing was dangerous. A discovered letter could be interpreted as slander. Whispered conversations were safer, shared only in locked chambers or outside castle walls. And for women, the silence was doubly enforced. A lady's maid might see her mistress suffer under a cruel marriage, yet she could say nothing. A young girl working in a laundry might return from a night gone wrong, and no one would ask why she limped. The silence around women's experiences in the castle was not just a matter of etiquette. It was a defense mechanism, a way to endure a life over which they had little control. The emotional toll was immense. Bottled words became bottled emotions. Servants learned to hide fear behind still expressions, fatigue behind quiet obedience, and even grief behind a bowed head. There was no room for weeping in the castle corridors, no space to speak aloud the pain of watching someone die from illness that could have been treated, or seeing cruelty enacted with impunity. And yet, within the silences, there were small rebellions. A plate placed slightly too hard on a table. A knowing glance shared between two maids. A song hummed just a little louder than permitted in the kitchen. These were not words, but they were messages, acts of subtle resistance, quiet declarations of presence. I am here. I see what you see. I am still human. Over time, some found ways to raise their voice, not through speech, but through action. A loyal servant might gain the trust of their master and slowly, quietly offer counsel. A steward might protect younger workers from harsh punishment. A nursemaid might tell stories to children that taught compassion without challenging the rules outright. Their voices were woven into the fabric of daily life, never loud, but always steady. Still, the overarching rule held: speak only when spoken to, and in that quiet, generations of voices were lost. The injustices witnessed, the kindnesses offered, the burdens carried in silence. All of these remained unrecorded, and yet they were real. They echoed in the stone walls long after the candles were snuffed out and the footsteps faded. In the strict social machinery of a medieval castle, silence was not simply encouraged, it was enforced. The moment a servant dared to break the invisible boundary between obedience and autonomy, the consequences could be swift and severe. Speaking out, whether it was a cry of protest, a whispered complaint, or even an honest warning, was perceived as insubordination, and insubordination was dangerous. While all castle workers were expected to maintain silence, it was women and young boys who bore the brunt of this unspoken law. The feudal system thrived on control, and language was a form of power. The noble class retained the right to speak freely, to debate, to command, and to question. Servants, in contrast, were trained explicitly and through observation, to listen, to obey, and above all, to remain quiet. Any deviation from this order was seen as a disruption to the delicate hierarchy that governed the castle. Punishment could take many forms. The most common was immediate dismissal. A kitchen girl who criticized a steward's food stores might find herself without work or references by sundown. A boy who tried to defend a fellow page from the Lord's reprimand might be sent home. Or worse, being before his peers to serve as an example. For those with no family nearby or no alternative employment, dismissal was not just inconvenient, it was potentially life-threatening. Without shelter, food, or community, many former servants became vagrants. Their futures eroded by a single moment of speech. Some punishments were subtler, yet equally destructive. A servant who spoke out might find herself reassigned to the worst tasks: scrubbing cesspits, working in drafty towers, or tending sick animals. These punishments were not recorded, not acknowledged. They simply happened. The castle itself seemed to turn against those who dared to use their voice. And for women, the risks were magnified. A maid who reported harassment or cruelty could easily be accused of lying. Her testimony, especially against a nobleman or steward, carried little weight in the eyes of authority. Instead of being believed, she might be labeled difficult or hysterical. Her reputation quietly tarnished until no one would speak to her, let alone trust her with tasks of responsibility. In some cases, such women were quietly married off, sent to live with distant relatives, or simply vanished from castle records entirely. There are sparse historical mentions of female servants who found themselves in court, often not as plaintiffs, but as the accused. Accusations of theft, disobedience, or immoral behavior were common tools of silencing. The records speak in cold, detached phrases, dismissed for insolence, removed due to disrespect. But beneath those lines lies the story of a girl who perhaps tried to protect another, who questioned a cruel command, or who simply cried too loudly one night. Boys, too, walked a tightrope. Pages were often noble-born but young and vulnerable. Many served under older squires or knights, performing a range of duties that could border on servitude. If a boy complained of mistreatment, be it physical or otherwise, he was often met with mockery or suspicion. Male honor dictated that boys endure, that they learn the ways of the court through silence, not through protest. Speaking out was seen as weakness, and weakness had no place in the corridors of power. For boys of common birth, grooms, errand runners, fire tenders, the expectations were even more rigid. Their silence was seen as a virtue. A good boy was one who could carry out orders without question, who kept his head low and his tongue tied. Any deviation invited punishment. not just from nobles, but from fellow servants who feared collective reprisal. The threat of corporal punishment hung constantly in the air. A public beating, the removal of privileges, a term in the castle's small prison. These were all ways to reinforce the value of silence. And because punishment was often arbitrary, it created a culture of fear. Servants learned to anticipate the moods of their superiors, to avoid eye contact, to answer only in short, deferential phrases. They watched their words vanish into the cold air, swallowed by stone walls that remembered everything and forgave nothing. Even the act of defending another could be dangerous. A cook who shielded a trembling maid from a steward's wrath might face censure herself. A stable boy who stepped in during a noble's drunken rage might be deemed insolent. Injustice multiplied in the silence. Those with the most empathy often carried the greatest risk. And yet, in rare moments, such acts of courage became legend among the lower ranks. Whispered in kitchens, honored in glances, and remembered in shared silence. The castle chroniclers, of course, rarely wrote about these moments. They recorded the movements of lords and ladies, the fortunes of war, the grandeur of feasts. The voices of servants, especially the punished ones, were erased, but archaeology and later accounts hint at their presence. The graffiti etched into stone walls, the marginal notes in the state ledgers, the small artifacts of daily resistance. Despite it all, the threat of punishment did not extinguish all voices. Some women found protection in numbers, sharing information in communal spaces like the laundry or the kitchens. Boys formed tight bonds, speaking in coded gestures and shared chores. These secret networks allowed stories to pass, truths to be preserved, and warnings to spread silently but surely. And sometimes, silence became strategy. Servants learned to listen carefully, to speak through action, and to endure without visible protest. Their voices lived in the careful polishing of boots, in the precision of a breakfast tray, in the unexpected kindness of a warm blanket left on a cold night. These were the voices that survived, not through speech, but through legacy. In the grand illusion of chivalry that surrounded castle life, the image of the noble knight, shining, gallant, and brave, stood tall in stories and song. Yet, behind this legend lay years of silent, invisible toil by boys who began as pages and slowly, patiently climbed the unadorned staircase toward knighthood. For most, that journey was long, cold, and without praise. A page's life began as early as 7 years old. He was usually of noble birth, sent away from home to live under the tutelage of another lord. The castle into which he entered was unfamiliar, imposing, and layered with quiet codes. From the first day, silence became his cloak. He was taught to listen, observe, and obey. Pages were not permitted to speak freely. They addressed only those of higher rank, responded succinctly, and never raised their voices. The tasks assigned to them were far from the glorious images of battle or courtly love. Pages cleaned armor, fetched water, ran messages, swept halls, dusted shelves, held candles at meals, and served wine with steady hands. They learned the intricacies of their master's moods, anticipating needs without being told. Their hands blistered from polishing metal, and their backs ached from carrying heavy equipment. But there was no room for complaint. To grumble was to be seen as ungrateful. To speak out of turn could mean humiliation or worse. Their training included reading, writing, and manners, but the bulk of their education was through physical labor and silent observation. They watched the hunts from afar, memorized sword drills from the edges of practice fields, and stood in stillness during court proceedings. Their names were rarely spoken. Their presence, though constant, was ghost-like. As they aged into their early teens, those who showed promise became squires. This shift did not lighten their burden. If anything, the expectations increased. A squire served a knight directly, managing weapons, tending horses, dressing and undressing their lord, and standing by during combat. He was expected to be at the knight's side at all times, alert and prepared, yet wordless and less addressed. In times of travel or conflict, squires slept little. They rode through the night, polished gear by torchlight, and patched wounds with trembling hands. Their loyalty was measured in quiet endurance. Even in moments of fear or exhaustion, they remained composed. It was said that a good squire made himself invisible, always present, never distracting. Recognition was rare. Knights took credit for valor in battle, elegance in court, and precision in appearance, all aided by the unseen efforts of their squires. Should a knight fail, the blame often trickled downward. If a sword was misplaced or a horse unsettled, the squire bore the shame. Praise, when it came, was quiet and often vague, a nod, a gesture, perhaps a word. But these small acknowledgments became precious. The emotional toll was considerable. Many young squires internalized the belief that they were tools, valuable only when useful. The weight of expectation rested heavily on boys barely into adolescence. They witnessed violence up close, bore secrets they could not share, and performed tasks that hardened them before their hearts had even fully opened. For every boy who eventually earned his knighthood, many were dismissed, injured, or lost along the way. An accident in training, a misstep in etiquette, or an unfortunate illness could halt a young squire's path in an instant. Without status or inheritance, these boys had little recourse. Some faded into the background of castle life, becoming lesser retainers, stable hands, or minor guards. Others vanished entirely from the records. And yet, the system persisted. Because for those who survived, knighthood meant status, land, and voice. But even then, the habits of silence lingered. Knights who once bowed in silence now commanded others to do the same. The cycle repeated. What had been endured was now enforced. Their silent years became a rite of passage, revered but not examined. Songs might mention the squires who served with loyalty, but never the tears they stifled or the wounds they hid. The ideal of the knight was polished and paraded, while the truth of the squire remained buried in the straw-strewn chambers and cold stone passages. And in those quiet spaces between tasks and commands, the boys often formed bonds, squire to squire, page to page. In shared chores, whispered stories, and stolen glances, they found small sanctuaries. The solidarity of shared silence became its own language, a comfort, a rebellion, and a form of survival. To be a lady-in-waiting in a medieval castle was to perform a delicate dance of proximity and detachment. Always close to power, but never allowed to wield it. These women, often noble-born themselves, served queens, princesses, and high-ranking noble women. Their daily lives were spent in the glittering chambers of the elite, surrounded by embroidered tapestries and silver combs. Yet they were bound by unspoken rules that dictated silence, restraint, and a graceful invisibility. A lady-in-waiting was expected to be seen but not heard. Her voice soft, her steps measured, her presence attentive but unassuming. Unlike servants who labored in kitchens or stables, these women worked in emotional labor, personal care, and constant vigilance. They dressed their mistresses' brushed hair, arranged jewelry, stitched gowns, read aloud from holy texts, and attended closely during private moments, childbirth, illness, mourning. And through all of this, they were not to speak their minds. Observation was both their duty and their prison. A lady-in-waiting was privy to the whispered sorrows of the noble woman she served, marital strife, courtly scandal, political anxieties, and private fears. But she was never to repeat what she heard. Silence was her greatest service. A careless word could destroy reputations, unravel alliances, or threaten entire families. Discretion was not merely valued, it was demanded. Their performance of calm and composure was ongoing, even when they themselves were ill, grieving, or under stress. There was little room for personal crises. A lady-in-waiting could be comforting her mistress while hiding the loss of her own mother. She might help a noble woman prepare for a feast just days after learning she would be married off without her consent. Her body and time were not entirely her own. Every hour of the day was shaped around someone else's needs. This unrelenting demand for grace extended to their posture, speech, and behavior. They were taught to walk in silence, to speak only when spoken to, and to never display overt emotion. Joy was allowed, but never exuberance. Sadness was permitted, but not sobbing. Anger had no place. Their identities blurred into the background of courtly life, a swirl of folded hands, bowed heads, and lowered eyes. Many of these women were highly educated, especially by the standards of their time. They could read, write, and manage correspondence. They understood etiquette, music, and the subtleties of court politics. Yet this knowledge was channeled towards serving others. A lady-in-waiting might pen letters for her mistress, organize inventories of gowns and jewels, or manage the logistics of travel, all without recognition. Marriage was one of the few exits from service. Yet even this came with restrictions. Marriages were often arranged by the lady's family or by the noblewoman she served. Some ladies-in-waiting were married off to secure alliances or reward loyalty, their futures determined by convenience rather than desire. Others remained in service for decades, aging within the same stone walls, their contributions forgotten the moment their usefulness ended. The relationships between mistresses and their ladies were complex. Some were genuine and affectionate, while others were coldly hierarchical. A trusted lady-in-waiting might become a confidant, a surrogate sister, or a quiet advisor. But this trust was fragile. A misstep, speaking too boldly, revealing a secret, or appearing to overstep, could lead to instant dismissal. And in dismissal, all protection vanished. Rumors were a constant threat. A lady-in-waiting who laughed too freely with a visiting nobleman might be suspected of flirtation. One who lingered in conversation with a steward could be accused of inappropriate familiarity. Whether the rumors were true did not matter. Perception was everything. A woman's reputation could unravel in hours, and the court offered no path for redemption. Despite the silence, many of these women left subtle marks on history. Some appear in letters, mentioned in passing as helpful, loyal, or present during great events. Others are glimpsed in the margins of chronicles, or remembered in household roles as recipients of gifts. A rare few, such as Marjorie Patton or Anne Boleyn, who began as ladies-in-waiting, stepped into more visible roles. But most disappeared, their names lost to time. Yet their influence was real. They were the ones who delivered messages between noble families, who comforted queens in childbirth, who steadied trembling hands during weddings, funerals, and ceremonies. They knew the rhythms of the castle better than many lords, and their silence held the weight of trust. In whispered prayers and midnight sewing circles, they shared fragments of themselves, hopes, doubts, and stories. These quiet connections formed a tapestry of female solidarity that resisted the isolating effects of court life. Through laughter muffled behind hands and songs hummed during long hours of needlework, they carved out a space for selfhood within the rigid roles they were given. To serve as a lady-in-waiting was to master the art of appearing still while holding 1,000 secrets. Their lives were shaped by dignity and denial, by elegance and endurance. They were the quiet architects of noble womanly grace. The hands behind the gowns, the voice behind the prayers, the presence behind the throne. In a medieval castle, geography was more than a matter of architecture. It was a manifestation of power. And nowhere was this more evident than in the placement of servant quarters. Hidden behind thick walls, tucked down winding corridors, or relegated to drafty upper levels, these spaces were not simply accommodations. They were deliberate acts of social design. Isolation was not accidental. It was embedded in the very stone, shaping how servants lived, moved, and understood their place. The great hall, the solar, the chapel, these were the heart of noble life. Places bathed in light, adorned with tapestries, warmed by hearths. The servants' world, by contrast, existed in the shadows. Kitchens were often located in outbuildings or cellars hot and dim, filled with smoke and clamor. Sleeping quarters were found in the attics or basements, far from sunlight and warmth. Narrow staircases separated their paths from those of the nobles. Their doors did not open onto grand vistas, but onto storage rooms, laundry courts, or blank stone. The spatial division sent a message. You are necessary, but not equal. You belong here, behind this wall, beneath this floor, beyond this gate. These physical boundaries reinforce psychological ones. Servants learned not to linger in noble spaces. They learned which thresholds they could not cross, which eyes to avoid, which silences to keep. Their rooms were crowded, cold, and utilitarian. Beds, if they had them, were little more than straw pallets. Walls were bare. Windows, if they existed, were small and unglazed. Clothing hung from pegs. Water was fetched in buckets. Privacy was minimal. In some cases, a servant might share sleeping quarters with half a dozen others, sometimes mixed by age, rank, or even gender. The noise of breathing, snoring, whispered conversations, and shifting bodies filled the nights. Yet even these modest spaces had their hierarchies. A senior maid might claim the corner furthest from the door. A favored valet might receive a slightly wider bed. Apprentices and young pages often slept near doors or hearths, their proximity to tasks more important than comfort. The arrangement of sleeping spaces reflected not personal preference, but function and favor. These spaces were also strategically placed to minimize interaction with noble residents. A castle was designed for surveillance and control, not only over enemies, but over its own people. Hidden doorways and servant staircases allowed workers to move unseen. Meals were carried through narrow passages. Coal was hauled before dawn. Maids swept floors before nobles rose. And when the family slept, servants returned to their corners, their labor done in the liminal hours. But this isolation came at a cost. Cut off from light, space, and beauty, the mental toll on servants could be considerable. Depression and fatigue crept into the bones. The constant reinforcement of low status, through space, silence, and separation, shaped how people saw themselves. A young scullery maid might grow into adulthood without once sitting at a real table. A footman might serve his entire life and never walk the castle grounds in daylight. Despite this, communities formed in these hidden quarters. Among shared chores and whispered gossip, servants built bonds. They told stories, shared scraps, helped each other stitch torn sleeves or clean dirty shoes. These moments of solidarity brought light into the gloom. In the kitchens, a joke might ripple across the workers. In laundry rooms, a tune might rise softly over the hiss of boiling water. Yet even these connections were bound by caution. Friendships were tested by competition, jealousy, and fear. A servant who displeased the steward could lose her room. A boy caught stealing bread might be sent away, and no one would speak of him again. Trust was both precious and dangerous. Many learned to protect themselves with silence, maintaining a careful distance even from those closest to them. Religion offered one of the few shared spaces. In the castle chapel, servants might pray alongside nobles, though often from the back rows or side aisles. Faith was a comfort, but even divine spaces mirrored earthly divisions. In sermons, humility and obedience were extolled. The servant's place in God's order was, like his place in the castle, one of deference. Over time, this isolation became self-reinforcing. Servants rarely left the castle, and outsiders rarely entered their world. Their memories, dreams, and aspirations were shaped by stone and custom. For many, even imagining a different life was difficult. They did not write letters, attend festivals, or sit for portraits. Their voices faded into mortar. Their names were not etched into the ledgers of history. And yet, their hands built the world. They kept the hearth burning, the clothing clean, the floors polished, the food cooked. They were the heartbeat behind the nobility's performance. Without them, the illusion of grandeur would collapse. In the subdued cadence of castle life, where footsteps echoed through stone corridors and voices rarely rose above a whisper, emotional expression was neither encouraged nor safe. For those in service, maids, squires, stewards, and washerwomen, stoicism was a necessity within the rigid hierarchy of medieval castles. To show feeling was to risk exposure, and exposure, even in the form of fatigue or sorrow, could be perilous. From the earliest days of their duties, servants were taught to wear emotional restraint like a second skin. A trembling hand, a tear-streaked cheek, or a furrowed brow could invite questions, suspicion, or punishment. Whether it was exhaustion after 14 hours of labor or grief over a sibling loss of plague, the correct response was the same: silence. This oppression was not merely practical, it was conditioned. A scullery maid who wept at her post might be deemed unfit. A stable boy who flinched at a shouted command risked being called weak. The act of hiding one's internal state became a survival strategy. Servants learned to stand still even when their knees ached, to smile faintly while their stomachs growled, and to nod dutifully when their minds were elsewhere. The architecture of the castle reinforced this emotional concealment. The stone walls were thick and unyielding, absorbing sound and offering no privacy. The drafty chambers offered no comfort. The shared sleeping spaces no solitude. There was nowhere to cry unseen, no space to breathe freely. If tears fell, They did so quietly into wash basins or behind barrels, swiftly wiped away before they were noticed. Fatigue, perhaps the most constant companion of castle servants, became something to be concealed rather than addressed. Bodies ached from repetitive labor, scrubbing floors, kneading dough, fetching water, stirring cauldrons. Yet slowness was reprimanded, and rest was rare. A maid who rubbed her back might be accused of idleness. A guard who leaned too long on his spear might be replaced. Hunger, too, was ever present. Meager rations did little to nourish bodies constantly in motion. Yet to ask for more food could be interpreted as greed. Instead, hunger was carried in silence, tucked behind tight-lipped smiles and firm postures. Over time, the physical gnawing dulled into a background thrum, one more discomfort to endure without acknowledgement. Pain, whether from illness or injury, was often dismissed. Servants tended to one another in hushed secrecy. A bruised hand was bound at night. A fever was hidden beneath layers. They whispered remedies, herbs from the garden, prayers to saints, compresses stolen from the laundry. Many kept working through sickness, their bodies fragile, their movements practiced and automatic. To stop was to risk replacement. Emotional pain was the least acknowledged and most deeply buried. Many servants endured loneliness, especially those who had been separated from family at a young age. They formed attachments quietly, a shared glance, a kind word, a small act of care. But even these moments were brief and guarded. Affection was dangerous. Jealousy, gossip, and power imbalances could destroy fragile bonds. Grief, too, was a private matter. When a fellow servant died, whether from accident, illness, or neglect, there was often no formal mourning. No eulogies, no carved stones. The work continued. Rooms were reassigned, clothes redistributed. Memories faded quickly, replaced by new tasks. Those who grieved did so alone, perhaps lighting a candle in a dark corner, whispering a name before sleep. Some found refuge in religion, though even prayer required discretion. Chapel attendance was expected, but personal devotions were quiet, folded into the rhythms of the day. A whispered rosary while folding linens, a psalm hummed under breath. Faith offered structure, if not comfort. The idea of a divine plan made suffering easier to bear, or at least to endure. The long-term toll of emotional suppression manifested in many ways. Some servants became rigid, emotionless even in their private moments. Others developed nervous habits, twitches, pacing, insomnia. Many lived in a state of quiet vigilance, always listening, always anticipating. Their bodies remained still, but their minds churned. In rare cases, suppressed emotions erupted. A sudden outburst in the kitchens, a shouting match in the laundry, a broken goblet in the great hall. These moments, when they happened, shocked both servants and nobles alike. Not because the emotions were foreign, but because they were finally visible. And visibility, for those whose lives depended on discretion, was perilous. Still, not all was bleak. Within the enforced silence, servants developed subtle languages of care. A bowl left on a windowsill for someone who missed dinner. A sleeve stitched overnight for a tired apprentice. A song hummed during long hours of ironing. These gestures were quiet rebellions, ways to maintain humanity amid dehumanization. Over time, the habit of hiding emotions became generational. Older servants taught younger ones when to smile, when to look away, how to mask disappointment. The unwritten rules passed from hand to hand, like a well-worn cloth. And as decades passed, the walls absorbed more than footfalls. They absorbed emotional residue of countless lives lived half visible. In the final moment of the day, as candles were snuffed and the stone halls fell into shadow, servants lay on their straw mats in silence. Their thoughts drifted, perhaps to a memory of family, of fleeting kindness, or the sound of laughter once heard in the courtyard. But even in dreams, many remained still. The habit of hiding was hard to unlearn. Chapter 5. Women worked, then disappeared. In the romantic imagination of medieval life, the noble woman is often reduced to a delicate figure at a window, perhaps weaving or sighing, a decorative presence in a world of knights and kings. But the reality behind the stone walls was far different. Noble women were not idle ornaments. They were administrators, mediators, and logistical minds. Their hands may not have wielded swords, but they managed the lifeblood of the castle, its daily function, its stores, and its household order. When the lord of the manor departed for war, pilgrimage, or courtly duty, it was the lady of the castle who stepped forward. With little fanfare, she assumed control not just of the household, but of vast agricultural estates. These lands required oversight. Rents collected, disputes settled, supplies purchased, and labor organized. The lady presided over manorial courts, issued instructions to reeves and bailiffs, and maintained relationships with tenants. Her role was not ceremonial. It was vital. If the harvest was poor, or a barn collapsed, or illness swept through the village, it was she who navigated the crisis. If a shipment of wool was late, or a guest arrived unexpectedly, it was she who ensured things continued smoothly. Her command was quiet but firm, often delivered through a steward or chamberlain, but understood as authoritative. Beyond the fields and financial records, she also ruled over the domestic rhythm of the castle. The kitchens, pantries, buttery, and brewhouse answered to her. She decided what was served at table, what was stored for winter, and what was distributed in alms. She monitored the textile production of the household, linen for undergarments, wool for outerwear, embroidery for chapel and chamber. Young women in her service learned to spin, sew, and dye under her supervision. In times of scarcity, her choices became sharper. Would the household reduce its meat allotments? Would the candles be rationed through Lent? She negotiated these tensions with pragmatism. A good lady ensured that the household endured, its standards upheld even in lean seasons. A wise one found subtle ways to stretch resources while maintaining appearances. Yet, despite the breadth of her responsibility, formal recognition was scarce. Medieval chronicles rarely mention these women by name unless they married royalty or funded a monastery. Their administrative acumen was folded into assumptions about womanly virtue. If they succeeded, it was expected. If they failed, it was remembered. Even written records often subsumed their efforts under the name of the absent lord. A surviving account book might bear his seal, though the entries were her work. A well-managed estate was praised as the lord's achievement. Her correspondence, when it survives, reveals a steady voice. Careful, practical, often lays her concern over debts, harvests, or labor shortages. These letters are precious fragments of presence. Her days were long. Before the sun crept over battlements, she was already awake, speaking with servants, examining stores, offering direction. She moved from chapel to hall to storeroom, always alert, always balancing the expectations of birth with the demands of labor. She supervised apprentices, heard disputes between maids, offered medical advice, or oversaw preparations for a guest. And yet, when the lord returned, she often faded back into the margin. Decisions reverted to his authority. The steward's reports went to him. Her contributions were acknowledged with a nod, perhaps, but not recorded. If the estate had prospered, it was through good fortune. If it struggled, the fault might be laid at her feet. Even in death, her legacy was often obscured. Tomb inscriptions praise obedience, chastity, and devotion, not intelligence, leadership, or resilience. Her portrait, if one existed, would depict her in quiet repose, hands folded, eyes lowered. The ink of her effort dried on pages that bore someone else's name. Still, the impact of her labor endured. The cloth she ordered clothed her family for winters. The treaties she negotiated averted feuds. The children she raised carried her discipline into adulthood. The orchard she planted bore fruit long after her passing. She may have vanished from the histories, but she shaped the very rhythm of castle life. Asterisk. Among the quietest figures in the castle's daily life were those whose hands ushered in new beginnings, midwives and wet nurses, women whose presence marked the first breath of the next generation, but whose names were rarely preserved beyond that moment. The midwife came with her satchel of linen cloths, herbs, and practiced hands. She was summoned in whispers, sometimes in haste, sometimes in dread, to chambers thick with candlelight and tension. There, while nobles prayed in adjoining rooms and servants stood silently with water, she crouched beside the birthing bed. She coaxed life into the world with knowledge not found in any book, but passed from woman to woman, generation to generation. She knew how to turn a child in the womb, how to ease pain with compresses of lavender and fennel, how to whisper reassurance even when hope was fading. Her work was sacred and often terrifying. Childbirth in the medieval world was perilous. A misstep could mean death for mother, child, or both. And yet, the midwife returned again and again, moving from village to manor, castle to cottage, bearing the weight of life and its risks on her callous palms. When the child was born to nobility, the castle rejoiced. Bells might ring, feasts might follow, but the midwife, despite her role in that joyous moment, quietly packed her tools and departed, often with no more acknowledgement than a coin or blessing. She was not invited to dine. She did not remain in portraits. Her knowledge, so crucial, lived on only in memory and repetition. Then came the wet nurse, another woman whose body, by virtue of its capacity, was drawn into the life of the castle. When noble mothers turned away from the rigors of breastfeeding, wet nurses stepped forward. They held the child close, nourished it from their own bodies, rocked it through fevered nights and restless cries. Often, they left their own children behind to do so. This act, giving of one's own milk to raise another's heir, was profound and intimate. Bonds formed, wordless and deep, between nurse and child. Yet the wet nurse was not considered kin. When the child was weaned, she was dismissed. Her contribution, so physical, so foundational, was politely erased, her absence noted only in the hunger of the child she once fed. Neither midwife nor nurse appeared in the castle's chronicles. Their voices were not recorded in legal documents, their decisions not cited in the annals of the family. And yet, without them, no dynasty could continue, no lineage survive. They held the line between generations with quiet strength and sleepless nights. Their names, if remembered at all, survive in the margins of baptismal records or the back pages of household accounts. But their legacy lives deeper still, in the lives they helped begin and the silent, enduring care they offered in the earliest moments of life. In the medieval castle, work began early, not just in the day, but in life. For many girls born into peasant families, the path toward adulthood started with a one-way journey through the gates of a noble household, often before they reached the age of reason. At 7 or 8 years old, these girls left behind their villages, their mothers, their games in the mud, and entered a world of duty, discipline, and silence. The rationale behind this early placement was partly economic. Sending a daughter into service meant one less mouth to feed at home, and in some cases, a small wage or at least food in return. But for the girls themselves, it was an abrupt and irreversible transformation. Their days became governed by bells and commands. Their movements were monitored, their voices softened into whispers. They were not guests in the castle, they were workers, and they were expected to act accordingly. A young maid's responsibilities varied depending on her assigned place in the hierarchy. Some assisted laundresses, scrubbing soiled linens in cold basins from dawn to dusk. Others served in the kitchen, peeling root vegetables, carrying buckets, or scouring pots nearly as large as themselves. Some were chambermaids, tasked with sweeping ashes from noble fireplaces, folding garments, or laying out clothing according to the mistress's wishes. They learned by imitation. There was no formal instruction, no easing into the routines. Instead, they watched the older maids and mimicked their movements, their restraint, their invisible strength. A misplaced spoon, a forgotten command, a slow step. Each mistake was met with rebuke. Discipline was firm, sometimes physical, yet the pressure to be perfect was constant. For a mistake reflected not just on the maid, but on the lady or steward she served. The emotional toll of such early labor was profound. These girls, still children by any modern standard, were often isolated from family and comfort. Friendships formed in the quiet corners of shared chambers or over whispered jokes during chores. But even those bonds were fragile. Competition for better duties, favoritism by supervisors, or the ever-present fear of dismissal kept them cautious. Despite years of loyal service, few girls rose beyond their assigned tier. Promotion to lady's maid or housekeeper required not only skill and experience, but luck, timing, and a powerful patron's favor. More often, the young girl who began folding linens at 7 was still folding them at 17, her body growing stronger, but her status unchanged. And yet, these maids were essential to the functioning of the castle. Their small hands lit candles, stitched hems, warmed beds, and carried water up countless stairs. They were the first awake and the last asleep. Their names were rarely recorded, perhaps a passing mention in an inventory or a letter, but their labor was everywhere. Some left the castle when they married, entering peasant life once more, though with the experience and discipline of castle training. Others remained in service for life, moving from one lord's house to another as staff shifted or estates changed hands. Their sense of self became bound to their tasks. They measured their worth in cleanliness, in quietness, in how little they were noticed. Yet beneath the still surface, many held their own dreams, a return home, a marriage of affection, a child of their own. Some managed to save coins in secret, hoping to one day leave. Others sent letters, if they were lucky enough to know how to write, to family they hadn't seen in years. And still others found solace in religion, in the carved saints of the chapel or the rhythm of daily prayers. Even in old age, few found comfort. A lifetime of labor left bodies bent, hands calloused, backs weary, without children or family. Some ended their days still in service, now helping raise the next generation of girls who would follow the same path. These young maids, often forgotten in history, were the quiet heartbeat of the medieval castle. They carried its warmth, its light, its order, and though their names are lost, the sound of their bare feet on cold stone, the hush of their breath in the early morning, still echoes faintly through time. In the quiet shadow of castle walls, where prayers whispered through stone chapels and laundry flapped on windy lines, childbirth stood as one of the most perilous rites a woman could endure. It was not only a personal passage for the public expectation. Marry, bear children, secure heirs. And for thousands of women, it was a final chapter, not a new beginning. The dangers of childbirth in the medieval period were manifold. Medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, and myths and misunderstandings often shaped the birthing experience. There were no antiseptics, no surgical interventions as we understand them today, no blood transfusions, and no consistent understanding of anatomy. A woman giving birth placed her life into the hands of her midwife, her God, and chance. Labor could last for days. There were no pain relievers beyond herbal infusions, and prayers murmured at the bedside. Complications that today would be swiftly addressed, breech positions, umbilical cord entanglement, hemorrhaging, were often fatal. A single prolonged contraction or delay in the baby's descent could cause irreparable internal damage. If the baby was too large, if the pelvis too narrow, or if labor stalled, there were few options. Tools like forceps were either unavailable or viewed with suspicion, and cesarean sections were a death sentence for the mother. Even successful births carried lingering risks. Puerperal fever caused by infection could set in hours or days after delivery, particularly in environments where cleanliness was an afterthought. A reused cloth, an unwashed hand, a stagnant basin of water, and it could introduce fatal bacteria. The symptoms progressed rapidly. Fever, chills, abdominal pain, delirium. Within a few days, many new mothers were gone. And then there was a silence. Women who died in childbirth were not always commemorated with song or sculpture. Their deaths were often recorded in church registers, if at all, with simple phrases. Wife of John, Marjorie, in childbed. No mention of the struggle, no record of the life lived before that final moment. Tombstones, if afforded, bore dates and little else. For peasant women, even that modest record was rare. Noble women fared slightly better in documentation, but not necessarily in outcome. Despite better food, clothing, and shelter, they too were vulnerable to the same medical ignorance. Their higher birth rates, driven by dynastic pressure, meant repeated exposure to risk. A noble woman might bear 10 or more children in her lifetime, with only half surviving to adulthood. She might die at 22 or 35, having never known a day free of the expectation to produce heirs. The rhythm of grief was predictable and often unspoken. Husbands remarried quickly to secure more children. Infants, if they survived, were passed to wet nurses or older daughters. The mother's absence, over time, became a quiet void. Her chamber was reused. Her name, perhaps, folded into a family tree. Her wedding veil stored in a chest, untouched. For the women who survived, the fear never faded. The memory of sisters, friends, or mothers who had not made it through hung heavily. Every labor was a gamble. Every breath of a newborn came with tears. Joy, yes, but also relief. And when the midwife pronounced both mother and child safe, it was a rare victory. Communal rituals attempted to bring comfort. Churching, a purification ceremony performed after childbirth, welcomed women back into the spiritual fold. But it was also a tacit reminder of the dangers they had passed through, if they returned at all. Some women approached this rite with reverence, others with weary resignation. The cultural silence surrounding maternal death perhaps reflected its frequency. When loss becomes common, language grows thin. Instead of poems and paintings, there were shrugs and quiet nods. Instead of legacy, there was laundry to fold and mouths to feed. Life continued, and with it, the unending cycle of risk. And yet, these women shaped the future. Every child they bore continued the line. Every hour of labor was a gift of survival, not just for the infant, but for the family, the household, the very fabric of castle society. Though they were rarely remembered by name, their legacy lived on in stone walls and living bloodlines. Marriage in the medieval world was rarely about love. For women, especially those tied to castle life, it was a transaction, a strategy, a means of securing land, alliances, or status. From the moment a girl was born into a noble family or even a wealthy merchant class, her future was mapped out not by her dreams, but by negotiations between men. Fathers, lords, kings. Daughters were assets. A dowry was arranged, a collection of goods, money, or property that a bride brought to her husband's family. The larger the dowry, the more advantageous the match. But even among the lower ranks of society, where financial stakes were smaller, the principle remained. A woman was passed from one male household to another. Her consent, while occasionally sought, was not considered essential. Marriages were arranged while girls were still in their early teens, sometimes even younger, with formal unions often occurred around the age of 14 or 15. In noble circles, marriages served political ends. A lord might marry off his daughter to strengthen ties with a rival family or secure peace with a neighboring territory. Kings married their daughters to foreign princes to cement alliances or claim distant thrones. The girl at the center of this exchange was often a silent party to the decision. She packed her belongings, mounted a horse or litter, and traveled to a new castle, a new life, and a new set of expectations. The wedding ceremony itself was frequently more symbolic than celebratory. In many cases, the bride and groom had never met before their vows were exchanged. The ritual emphasized transfer of name, of lineage, of power. The woman became part of her husband's family, expected to abandon old loyalties and adopt new ones. Her primary duty, often explicitly stated, was to bear children, preferably sons, and manage the domestic sphere. And yet, her rights were few. Legally, a married woman was subsumed into her husband's identity. She could not own property independently, make contracts, or even travel freely without his permission. Her body was not her own. Conjugal rights were assumed, and refusal was often treated as defiance. Abuse, though rarely recorded, was common and difficult to escape. Divorce was virtually unheard of, and annulments were rare and expensive. Widowhood offered some respite, and in many cases, widowed women gained a measure of autonomy. They might manage estates, oversee household affairs, or even re-enter the marriage market with more control. But even here, freedom was limited. A widow with valuable property could be remarried by force or manipulation, her assets absorbed into a new family's holdings. For working-class women, the dynamics were similar but even more precarious. Marriage meant combining households and labor, but also submitting to the authority of a husband who might be a fellow servant, a craftsman, or a laborer. Love might grow, but economic need often dictated the match. A maid who became pregnant out of wedlock could face dismissal, shame, or worse. Marriage, for many, was less a sanctuary and more a survival tactic. Women who resisted marriage, who chose religious life or tried to remain single, were viewed with suspicion. Nuns were respected, but also seen as apart from the world. Unmarried women of age were often assumed to be unmarriageable, deviant, or failures. Few paths existed for a woman to define her life outside of the roles of wife or mother, and when they have fulfilled those roles, when the children were born, the dowry spent, the household managed, many women disappeared from record. Their contributions were absorbed into their husbands' legacies. Their names faded from documents. Their identities, like the initials sewn into linens or carved into the underside of furniture, were hidden from view. Despite this erasure, women shaped medieval society in countless ways. Through quiet resilience, through clever management of households, through whispered advice to husbands or sons, they left their mark. But the system they lived within treated them, by and large, as extensions of male power, a tool, a promise, a price. Inside the towering walls of medieval castles, daily life was sustained not by the clash of swords or the roar of feasts, but by quiet, repetitive, and essential labor, most of it performed by women. These tasks, often labeled as women's work, were integral to the smooth operation of the household. Yet, in both their time and in historical record, they were routinely undervalued, dismissed, or forgotten altogether. Take embroidery, for example. More than simple decoration, embroidery was a marker of lineage, devotion, and prestige. Banners bearing family crests, ecclesiastical garments adorned with sacred symbols, and ornate tapestries that lined castle walls were all products of countless hours of meticulous handwork. These items told stories, recorded genealogy, and offered warmth against the cold stone. Women embroidered not only for beauty, but as a means of preserving identity and history. Still, this form of creative labor was seldom credited. Tapestries were signed by patrons, not artisans. Needles were wielded by invisible hands. Cleaning, too, was more than a matter of tidiness. Castles were drafty and dusty, often filled with the residue of mud-tracked boots, soot from hearths, and the constant influx of people and animals. Floors had to be swept, rushes replaced, linen scrubbed and aired, soot scrubbed from hearths, and chamber pots discreetly emptied. The cycle was constant, invisible in its repetition. If done well, it went unnoticed. If neglected, it was seen as a failing, not of the structure, but the woman assigned to care for it. Then there was education. While formal schooling was rare for most medieval children, many received their earliest instruction from women, mothers, governesses, or ladies-in-waiting. These women taught reading and writing where possible, religious doctrine, manners, and the skills required to manage a household. In noble families, girls learned sewing, music, and herbal medicine. Boys learned the early values of duty and order. These foundational teachings shaped the character of future knights, clerics, and ladies. And yet, when historians spoke of a warrior's valor or a king's wisdom, they rarely looked to the quiet tutors who instilled discipline at their earliest age. This devaluation was rooted in gender norms of the time. Men's work, hunting, governing, fighting, was seen as active and public, while women's work was private, domestic, and therefore lesser. Yet, without the domestic realm functioning well, the public one could not exist. A noble could not ride to war without a warm cloak. A priest could not preach without vestments. A child could not inherit without first surviving infancy, nurtured by a nursemaid's round-the-clock care. The labor of women extended to medicine and midwifery, herbal preparation, animal husbandry, weaving, candle-making, and food preservation. All were skills that took years to master, but because they were taught through oral tradition or passed down in practice rather than recorded in scrolls or charters, they were left out of most formal accounts. Even within castles, these roles offered little recognition. The cook might be celebrated for a grand feast, but the girl who turned the spit for hours went unnamed. The noble woman who managed household accounts, ordered supplies, organized festivals, and kept inventories was expected to do so with grace and humility, as if it were second nature, not skill. The phrase women's work became a dismissal, a way to minimize the labor without understanding its weight. But the weight was real. The hours were long, the skills complex, and the responsibility immense. If a meal was late, if garments were unwashed, if a child was improperly dressed, blame followed. Praise was rare. And yet, women continued. Through candlelit nights, through aching hands, through pregnancies and loss, they continued. because life inside the castle depended on it, because survival often rested on their shoulders, because they knew, even if no one wrote their names into the stone, that they were holding up a world. In the next chapter, we'll shift our focus beyond women's experiences to those of others who served the castle in anonymity, the scribes, guards, laborers, and servants who lived in the shadows and left behind almost no trace at all. Chapter 6. Forgotten Lives in the Shadows. The lifeblood of any castle was not found in the grand feasting halls or echoed in the lofty proclamations of its lord. Instead, it pulsed quietly, very quiet. These individuals, though vital to the daily operations of the stronghold, were rarely honored in chronicles or remembered by name. Scribes, for example, were responsible for more than mere transcription. They kept estate records, cataloged supplies, copied legal documents, and sometimes even composed correspondence on behalf of the nobility. In an age when literacy was a rarity, especially among the peasantry, these literate workers were both valuable and vulnerable. Their work required concentration, long hours, and careful precision. Yet few were praised, and fewer still were ever named in the documents they produced. The ink-stained hands behind the words were lost to time. Guards, too, lived in obscurity, positioned along battlements and gatehouses. They braved the cold, wind, and occasional danger with little more than routine pay and strict orders. They were not the heroic knights of legend, clad in shining armor, but rather weary men in worn cloaks, watching for movement on the horizon. Their shifts blurred from dusk to dawn, often spent in silence, with only the creak of a torch bracket or cry of a night bird for company. If they were injured or killed, their replacement came swiftly. The record rarely noted their absence. Footmen were the silent movers of the castle. They carried trays, held doors, guided guests, and relayed orders. Their days were filled with walking, waiting, and watching. They existed in the periphery, trained to be efficient but invisible. Like shadows, they flowed through stone corridors, adjusting tapestries, refilling goblets, lighting candles. And when the day ended, they returned to modest quarters, often with only a single blanket and shared straw bedding to rest upon. No chronicler recounted their errands. No poem mourned their passing. This absence from history is not accidental. It is systemic. Medieval record-keeping focused on property, titles, battles, and clergy. The nobleman's was recorded, the lady's dowry tallied, the knight's deed remembered, but the daily efforts of those who supported them, the men who kept the gates closed, the ledgers legible, and the servants in motion, were overlooked. Archaeological evidence occasionally restores their presence. A scratched name in the margin of a manuscript, a broken comb in servants' quarters, a shoe sole mended again and again. These fragments hint at a life lived, a job done, a place held in the silent rhythm of castle life. But even these traces are rare, and so they remain mostly unnamed, these essential workers. Yet without them, the entire castle would falter. The letters would go unwritten. The halls would go unguarded. The lord's table would remain unset. Their silence was not insignificance. It was necessity. And in the quiet of history's pages, their echo endures. The towering presence of medieval castle often inspires awe. Its high stone walls, looming towers, and arched gateways seem to defy time. But behind every inch of that imposing structure was a labor of countless individuals whose names, stories, and sacrifices have been lost to history. These were the masons, the quarrymen, the roofers, the woodcutters, and the water haulers. They worked in silence and shadows, shaping not only stone, but the very skeleton of feudal society. The construction of a castle was no small feat. It could span decades, even centuries. With new wings added, battlements raised, moats widened, and towers reinforced long after the original cornerstone was laid. Each project called for massive quantities of raw material, and even greater quantities of human labor. Stones had to be quarried and shaped, sometimes far from the build site, then hauled by oxen or cart. Timber had to be felled, seasoned, and transported. Lime had to be burned for mortar, and all of it assembled by hand. Stonemasons were at the core of the process. Highly skilled yet largely anonymous, they cut stone into uniform blocks, shaped arches, and carved decorative elements. Though master masons occasionally had their names recorded, their apprentices and journeymen did not. These men worked with mallets and chisels from dawn to dusk, in dust-filled air on scaffolding high above the ground. Injuries were common, and when they fell, or when stones did, they often died without fanfare, their places quickly filled by others. Laborers performed the unskilled but essential work, digging moats, carrying stones, preparing mortar, clearing debris. Their days were grueling, their compensation minimal. They ate coarse bread and drank watered ale. Their bodies bore the toll of repetition, blisters, joint pain, exhaustion. Their injuries healed slowly, if at all, and though they touched every surface of the castle with their hands, they left no mark in the records. Repair work was constant. Castles were not static. They shifted with the ground, crumbled under weather, suffered damage from conflict or time. Roof tiles had to be replaced, beams strengthened, wells re-dredged. For every stone that remained, someone had once braced a ladder, climbed to a cold roof, and secured against wind and rain. These were not dramatic moments. They happened in quiet, thankless intervals. But without them, the walls would have collapsed. Artisans, too, played their part. Blacksmiths who forged the iron hinges, carpenters who crafted doors and floors, glaziers who shaped the rare stained glass windows. Most were summoned for a season or a specific task, then moved on. Few were local. Many traveled with tools in hand, working under contract before returning to obscurity. Even when they created beauty, an arched entryway, a carved lintel, a decorative gargoyle, their names were omitted, the credit given to patrons or lords. At times, these workers were pressed into service through obligation, like serfs repaying a lord's command. Others were itinerant laborers, moving from project to project in search of bread and coin. Some were prisoners or debtors, working under threat or coercion. Still others were children, expected to haul water, clean tools, or gather firewood. In these roles, family lineage meant little. Skill meant survival. Legacy was a luxury none could afford. Even in the rare event that a castle commemorated its construction, via inscription or record, the names listed were patrons, not workers. A lord might be praised for raising the outer wall in the year of our Lord, but the hands that hauled the lime or laid the stones remained unnamed. For every inscription preserved in stone, there were 1,000 calloused palms unrecorded. Archaeological digs sometimes uncover tools, work shoes, or temporary shelters used by these laborers. These fragments offer fleeting glimpses into their daily grind, their diets, their makeshift sleeping quarters, the coins they carried. Yet the human stories remain frustratingly incomplete. Without letters, portraits, or tombstones, we can only imagine their voices. And so the castles remain grand, stoic, and mysterious. Tourists marvel at the vaulted ceilings, the arrow slits, the curtain walls. Guides speak of kings and invasions, of sieges and ballads. But seldom do they speak of the laborers, the ones who bled into the mortar, who sweated beneath sun and frost, who carried the weight of feudal ambition on their backs. In silence, they built the world around them, and in silence, they disappeared from it. Among the many unseen lives that flowed through the winding corridors of medieval castles were children, some barely taller than a hearthstone, others already bearing the quiet resignation of labor far beyond their years. These children served in the lowest roles of the domestic hierarchy, often conscripted by circumstance, family necessity, or orphanhood. The castle was not a place of fairy tales for them, but a labyrinth of toil, fatigue, and anonymity. In kitchens, children tended fires that burned all day, hauling wood up narrow, smoke-darkened stairs. They washed vegetables in cold basins, ground grain into flour, and scrubbed pots blackened from years of open flames. Many served as scullions, the very lowest rung, who worked in constant proximity to heat and knives, shouted commands, and slippery floors. A single moment's distraction might mean a burn, a cut, or a punishment. There was little room for play, less for praise. And should they falter, the punishment was not merely verbal. Discipline could be swift and harsh, a cuff to the ear, a switch across the back, or days without bread. In the stables, the days began even earlier. Children woke before the sun to feed and water the animals. They mucked out stalls, groomed horses, and carted bales of hay. Their hands blistered from pitchforks and rope, their backs bent under loads meant for grown men. Some slept in lofts above the stables. Others curled near the hearths of the kitchen. Their clothing was rough, usually handed down or hastily stitched. Shoes were a privilege. Many went without. Even in the frostbitten months of winter, they bore the marks of their labor. Calloused hands, soot-smudged skin, hollow eyes that had seen too much of life's difficulty far too early. Their hours were long, dawn to dusk and then some. During feasts or hunts, they might be summoned at all hours, carrying messages, fetching forgotten tools, holding lanterns as noblemen returned late through the castle gates. They were expected to be quiet, invisible, and quick. To stumble or break something might result in the wrath, not just of a superior, but the noble whose comfort had been disturbed. There was no protection from status, no safe recourse. Children lived at the mercy of those they served. Most of these children were not formally apprenticed. They were not being trained for advancement in a trade. They were simply filling a need. An extra pair of hands for tasks deemed too menial, too tiring, or too dirty for others. Their service often began as early as age 7. And while some might eventually rise to become stable masters or head cooks, many remained exactly where they started, anonymous and expendable. Injury was common. A spilled pot of boiling water, a kick from a startled horse, a fall from a loft. Medical care was rudimentary at best. Wounds festered. Fevers went unnamed. When a child died, the work shifted to another. A name might be muttered, a prayer said, but the record books did not pause. The castle moved on unflinching. Some children were born within castle walls to servants and laborers. Others were sent by their families. Too poor to feed another mouth, hoping a position might offer food and shelter, however meager. Still others were taken in after losing their parents to plague, war, or famine. The castle became their world, but not one of warmth and wonder. It was a place of hard stone, hard work, and harder expectations. Even in later years, those who grew old within the castle rarely left a trace. They might age into the quiet figure who still lit the torches at night, or the hunched kitchen aide who remembered the Lord's grandfather. Their stories passed in whispers, never in ink. Their memories faded like candle smoke, and with each passing generation, their presence dissolved further into obscurity. The archaeological record offers almost nothing. Children's belongings were small and ephemeral, wooden toys, simple beads, a well-worn spoon. Most were buried without gravestones, often in communal pits or near servant quarters. Their bones, when found, show signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, and repetitive strain. Silent evidence of lives worked too hard, too early. Some remains suggest developmental delays brought on by long-term undernourishment. Others show fused joints or curved spines, the body reshaped by burdens it was never meant to carry. In stories, the castle kitchen is sometimes imagined as a warm haven, full of savory smells and laughter. But for these children, it was hot, chaotic, and unforgiving. The stables might seem romantic, ponies and noble steeds, but they reeked of dung and demanded endless labor. There was no childhood here, not in the sense we understand. No schoolroom, no bedtime stories. Only tasks, tools, and the weary repetition of necessity. These young ones were not preparing for knighthood or maidenhood. They were not apprentices in artistry or heirs to great halls. They were the gears that turned unseen, the small figures who swept, stirred, and suffered day after quiet day. And when they were gone, the castle kept going. Their hands built the rhythm of daily life, but their names vanished into it. In the vast silence of stone corridors and beneath the weight of castle roofs, their stories echo faintly. Fragments of forgotten childhood spent in service to splendor that never belonged to them. In the shadows of the high towers and great halls, within the fringes of castle life, there moved a quiet trio of professions whose lives left almost no ripple on the surface of recorded history. The minor clergy, herbalists, and falconers, though integral to the inner workings of the castle, often lived in obscurity, their contributions unacknowledged, their names forgotten, and their final resting places unmarked. The minor clergy formed the spiritual backbone of castle life, yet they were not the bishops or abbots remembered in illuminated manuscripts or marble effigies. They were the low-ranking chaplains, scribes, and confessors. Their duties were numerous but unglamorous. Daily prayers, maintaining liturgical order, copying sermons, and tending a small oratory within the keep. Often serving only a single noble household, they remained tethered to its rhythms, rarely leaving the castle walls. Their prayers echoed softly through empty chapels at dawn and dusk, yet no choir chroniclers would preserve their names. They lived modestly, occupying spare rooms or chambers near the chapel. Their clothing was simple: coarse robes and earth tones, a worn cross hung from the neck, a satchel of sacred texts always near. While they were men of learning, few had the resources or recognition to write chronicles of their own. When they died, they were buried with minimal ceremony, sometimes in the castle yard, sometimes near the chapel, but rarely beneath a stone bearing their name. Their faith was silent. Their end, quieter still. Herbalists, too, held essential knowledge, often passed down through generations, and almost always undervalued. These were the healers of the castle, tasked with treating wounds, mixing poultices, and crafting salves from gathered roots and dried flowers. Their skill often walked a thin line between medicine and superstition, and though nobles might consult them in private, they were never fully trusted. In times of sickness, they were summoned urgently. In times of health, they were kept at a distance. Most herbalists were women, elderly or middle-aged, with dirt under their nails and baskets of pungent herbs slung over their arms. Their homes were often in the outer buildings of the castle, or even just beyond the walls, where their gardens grew in messy abundance. They knew the rhythms of the land better than anyone, which bark soothed fever, which flower encouraged sleep, which root numbed pain. But they wrote nothing down, and if they did, those scraps did not survive. When illness struck and leeches failed, it was a herbalist who was called, yet if the patient worsened, it was the herbalist who was blamed. Suspicion clung to them like the scent of dried sage. They were rarely honored, and in times of unrest or accusation, they were the first to be cast out, or worse. When they died, few mourned aloud. Their tools were passed to another. Their huts were claimed by weeds, their bones left to rest unnamed. Falconers, though slightly more visible, occupied a liminal space between servant and craftsman. They trained birds of prey for the nobles' hunts, hawks, falcons, kestrels, raising them from fledglings, binding them to glove and horn, and ensuring they were sharp-eyed and swift. A nobleman might take pride in his falcon, but it was a falconer who had taught it to soar and strike. Their work required patience, silence, and a deep understanding of avian behavior. These men, and occasionally women, lived near the mews, the special structures where the birds were housed. Their days were spent feeding, mending jesses and hoods, and walking the fields in quiet preparation for a noble's leisure. They spoke little. They listened always. And when a falcon succeeded, it was the noble who was cheered. The falconer's garb was plain: leather gloves, thick tunics, and sleeves reinforced with talons. Their hands bore scars of bird and rope. Their eyes scanned the skies more than they met the gaze of peers. They did not dine with nobles, nor were they remembered in household roles. If they fell ill or passed on, another would take their place. Their birds might mourn, but history would not. None of these figures were meant to stand in the spotlight. Their labor was vital, yet designed to be silent. They moved in the margins, between ceremonies, behind tapestries, beneath cloisters. They touched lives, eased suffering, trained grace into instinct, but they did so in anonymity. No portraits were painted of them. No heraldry bore their symbols. No bard sang of their deeds. And in the soft, shifting sands of castle life, they vanished, not in disgrace, not in failure, but simply because the stories that were told, those carved into stone and sung in hall, were never meant to include them. They lived now in fragments. A mortar and pestle found near a garden wall. A page of an herbal pinned in the binding of a later volume. A carved wooden perch, worn smooth by talons, buried beneath a collapsed stable. And in the stillness of those discoveries, we remember, just for a moment, the quiet, essential lives that passed unseen beneath the grandeur of castle towers. Walk through any medieval castle restored for modern eyes, and you'll see tapestries of battles, portraits of nobles in rich fabrics, and genealogies etched into stone. These were the faces preserved, the names kept safe in ink and memory. But for every lord painted in oils and every lady named in prayer books, there were hundreds, thousands, who lived within those same walls, whose names were never written down, whose stories slipped through the cracks of parchment and stone. These were the bakers, the water carriers, the broom wielders and stair scrubbers, the ones who rose before dawn and retired long after the candles were extinguished. They filled the halls with quiet footsteps and the kitchens with low voices, and yet they remain invisible to the historical record. No chronicler paused to describe the hand that sewed the Lord's doublet or the fingers that poured his wine. Few recorded the young boy who fetched arrows for a hunt or the woman who prepared his bath. These people were considered part of the setting, background details to a story centered always on the powerful, and so their lives faded with the passing of the day. Nobles and their lineages were zealously recorded, their births, marriages, triumphs, deaths, all captured in careful script. Illuminated manuscripts detailed their piety. Court poets sang of their deeds. But there are no volumes of the servant who cleaned the candle wax from chapel floors for 40 years. No statue for the steward who kept the accounts balanced and the pantry full. No song for the maid who raised children not her own, then died in childbirth with none to mourn her but the cook. Art, too, overlooked them. Castle murals and manuscripts favored saints, kings, and heavenly visions. When commoners were depicted, it was in the abstract, as generic peasants, symbols of toil or vice, not as individuals. The real faces, the tired, weathered, hopeful, or frightened faces, were never painted. The artist's brush did not find them worthy. Even in moment of crisis, plague, fire, siege, it was the fate of the noble household that was documented. Who fled, who survived, who made alliances. Rarely do the texts mention how many servants died in the cold, how many stable hands were pressed into battle, how many washerwomen starved when stores ran low. Their griefs, like their labor, were assumed and unspoken. Sometimes we catch glimpses, a scribbled name on a laundry list, a passing reference in a steward's account, a single grave marked H, perhaps Helen or Hugo or merely household. Archaeology helps. Uncovering shoes worn through the heel, pots mended repeatedly, rooms where countless bodies shared air and heat. But these are not stories told. They are stories interpreted, imagined, guessed. Yet it is important to remember, for every lord in silk, there were 10 and were behind him. For every knight in armor, a dozen hands that clean his gear. For every grand feast, a phalanx of unseen cooks and servers. Their presence made the castle function. Without them, the grandeur was hollow, and they were not nameless to each other. In life, they called out names in the dark of early morning. They whispered prayers over bruises and broken dreams. They shared bread and burdens. Their community, though unrecorded, was real. They laughed, they wept, they hoped, they aged, and when they died, the world continued as if they had never been. We look back now and see only outlines. But those outlines tell us that castle life was never just a story of nobles and stone. It was a story of countless souls whose names were not forgotten because they didn't matter, but because the world chose not to remember. Let us remember now, in the long silence that stretches between centuries. It is not the names of the forgotten that speak to us, but the things they touched, the footprints they left in stone, and the bones they left beneath it. Archaeology has become the last whisper of their presence, the final thread linking our modern hands to theirs. But even as it reveals traces of their lives, it does not restore their stories. Within the ruins of medieval castles, long since stripped of their banners and voices, the smallest finds can be the most human. A child's wooden toy worn smooth, a set of cooking implements charred by fire and use, a simple comb carved from bone. These are not the treasures of nobility, gilded in gold or adorned with crests. These are the tools of life, the objects once carried, used, and cherished by those for whom history left no surname. Bones, too, are found in castle graveyards, near kitchens, beneath stairwells long collapsed. The skeletons of men and women who once drew water, stitched linen, or fetched firewood in the dawn hours. Their joints often bear the marks of repetitive labor, elbows worn from lifting, spines curved from carrying, knees ground down by years spent kneeling on stone. In the smallest frames, we find children's bones, some incomplete, others never grown. Their brief lives recorded not in ledgers, but in calcium and clay. Archaeologists interpret what they can. A thickened femur speaks of strength or strain. Dental grooves tell a diet full of grit and coarse grain. Burial placement hints at status, or lack thereof. But these are only shadows. The bones do not tell us who sang while they worked, who wept at night, who shared a crust of bread with a friend on a freezing morning. Tools unearthed in servant quarters are not labeled with their owners. A broom handle worn by 1,000 sweeps. A copper pot with soot baked into its bottom. A spindle balanced for fingers long vanished. We may imagine the woman who used it, bent over wool in the low light of a single window, but her name, her voice, remained beyond our reach. Even when personal items are found, brooches, rings, small tokens, they seldom tell us more than the outline of a life. A cross suggests faith. A needle case, industry. But whose faith? Whose work? These questions echo through the silence of excavated soil. And for many, even these fragments are missing. The most impoverished left no belongings behind. They lived in spaces so temporary, so crowded, that nothing survived the centuries but the faint depression of footpaths and the uneven stone of kitchen thresholds worn thin. The work of archaeologists is reverent, careful, and illuminating, but it is also bound by the silence of time. They can tell us what people ate, how they walked, how old they were when they died, but not what they dreamed of, not what made them laugh, not what they feared on stormy nights when the castle groaned the wind. And so, for the vast majority of castle inhabitants, the invisible laborers, the quiet caretakers, their stories remain unwritten, not because they lacked value, but because the quills of their time passed them by. Still, in every stone uncovered, in every tool brushed clean of dust, in every set of bones laid bare beneath the sky, there is something sacred, a presence, a pause, a reminder that behind every wall once warmed by fire, someone built that fire, that every garment stitched for a noble shoulder was hemmed by weary fingers, that beneath every celebration echoed footsteps of those who had prepared it. And though archaeology cannot tell us their names, it tells us they were there, real, needed, alive. We are the first to witness their traces in centuries. And in that witnessing, perhaps, a sliver of their story survives. Chapter 7. Luxury was a lie. When we imagine a medieval banquet, the picture is often dazzling. Tables laden with roast meats, jeweled goblets brimming with wine, platters of candied fruits, and the hum of minstrels and merriment. Yet beneath this illusion of opulence lay a quiet truth. Much of the food on those grand tables was far from fresh. Even the wealthiest noble households, stocked with stores and servants, were not immune to the rot that crept into every corner of castle life, especially onto their plates. Preservation techniques in the Middle Ages were rudimentary. Salt, smoke, and vinegar were relied upon to delay the inevitable spoilage of meat and fish. Without refrigeration, even these methods could not prevent food from turning if it traveled long distances, sat too long in pantries, or was handled without the benefit of modern hygiene. And food often did travel. Delicacies were brought in from distant manors, markets, or ports, adding both prestige and peril to the noble table. To hide the foul taste or odor of meat that had begun to turn, cooks resorted to the heavy use of spices. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and saffron were sprinkled liberally not for flavor alone, but as a kind of culinary disguise. These spices were expensive, imported from the East at great cost, and their very presence on the table served as a symbol of wealth and sophistication. But behind their aromatic veil was a less appetizing reality. Beneath the clove and cardamom, the meat may have been slimy, darkened, or sour. It was a subtle game between cook and diner. Those seated at a high table might praise a particularly piquant stew, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that its flavor masked decay. For many nobles, the extravagance of the feast outweighed the discomfort it might bring later. Dishes were chosen for spectacle and abundance, not health or nutrition. And so, feast became a strange balance between indulgence and risk. The symptoms of foodborne illness were well known, if not well understood. Vomiting, cramps, fevers. They might follow a celebration and be attributed to imbalance of humors or bad air. In reality, spoiled meat or tainted dairy could be the culprit. Yet little changed. The presentation of plenty remained paramount, and complaints were often hushed. Even the bread, symbol of sustenance, was not always safe. Flour might be made from poor quality grain, stored improperly, infested with insects or mold. Noble kitchens attempted to source better ingredients, but the sheer volume required to feed an estate made perfection impossible. Bakers added ash or chalk to make flour stretch further or appear whiter, and the result was bread that looked fine but could irritate the gut. In times of famine or siege, the situation worsened. Spoilage became inescapable, and meals grew more dangerous than filling. Nobles fared better than the poor, of course, but that did not mean their meals were safe. Rot did not discriminate by rank, and so the luxurious dining hall, with its golden plates and embroidered linens, often had the same truth found in the peasant's bowl. The food could make you sick. The grandeur masked vulnerability. The aroma of spice masked decay. In this way, even those who seemed to feast were not always fortunate. Asterisk, medicine in the medieval world was as much a matter of belief as it was of knowledge, and often leaned heavily on the former. Even among the nobility, access to physicians did not guarantee healing. In many cases, it meant submitting to rituals, theories, and treatments that today seem more like punishments than cures. The foundation of medieval medical understanding was a theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was thought to depend on a careful balance between them. Illness, therefore, was a matter of imbalance, and treatment aimed to restore equilibrium. This could mean bloodletting, induced vomiting, purging, or the application of leeches. The more severe the symptoms, the more aggressive the methods employed. For nobles, physicians were summoned from respected circles, often university-trained, and learned in Latin texts. But their knowledge, drawn largely from Galen and Hippocrates, was centuries old and rarely updated. Observation played a minor role. Instead, diagnosis relied on examining the color of urine, the texture of a tongue, or the rhythm of a pulse, guided more by doctrine than by science. A noble suffering from fever might be bled from the arm with a silver knife. The blood collected and examined for signs of imbalance. If that failed, they might be offered a potion brewed from herbs, animal fats, and even powdered gems, an expensive blend with no guaranteed benefit. Illnesses of the mind or spirit might be treated with prayer, pilgrimage, or wearing charms to ward off evil. Infections were misunderstood. Wounds were cleaned with wine or vinegar, but rarely sterilized. If rot set in, physicians had little recourse. Amputation was known, but without anesthesia or antiseptics, the procedure was perilous. Nobles often refused it, choosing suffering over the likelihood of death on the table. Some treatments were purely symbolic. Gold leaf was thought to restore vitality. Ground pearls could aid digestion. Unicorn horn, usually narwhal tusk, was prized as an antidote to poison. These ingredients, while fashionable, were more valuable than effective. Their use spoke to desperation and belief rather than knowledge. Mental illness was cloaked in fear. Noble women who suffered from what might now be recognized as depression or anxiety were prescribed quiet seclusion, prayer, or even exorcism. Men who raved from fever or trauma were considered cursed or dangerous. The concept of psychological care was centuries away. Astrology also influenced treatment. Physicians consulted the stars before prescribing medicines or conducting surgeries. A procedure might be delayed because Mars was ascendant or the moon was waning. To modern minds, this seems quaint, but to a medieval noble, it was a trusted precaution. Ironically, the poorest sometimes fared better. Peasants relied on folk remedies, herbs from the forest, wisdom passed from midwives and herbalists. Their cures, while unsophisticated, often addressed symptoms with practical knowledge. Nobles, trapped by prestige and tradition, placed their fates in hands guided by books rather than lived experience. Even in the glow of candlelit halls and the murmur of minstrels, a shadow of fear haunted noble feasts, an ever-present anxiety that every bite might bring not pleasure, but death. The fear of poisoning, subtle and silent, became a quiet obsession among the medieval elite. For those with power, enemies were many, and meals, public, ceremonial, and unavoidable, were a point of vulnerability. To guard against this invisible threat, many nobles employed food tasters. trusted servants whose sole task was to sample each dish before it reached the noble's lips. The practice was both a precaution and a ritual. The taster would observe the preparation, inspect ingredients, and take the first bite. Then they would wait, under the gaze of cooks, guards, and the noble themselves. If no symptoms appeared after several minutes, the dish would be deemed safe. But even then, trust was never complete. The fear extended beyond the plate. Drinking vessels were scrutinized, as were the hands that poured from them. Goblets were often made of precious metals believed to change color in the presence of poison. Alchemists claimed certain stones, such as agate or bezoars, could neutralize toxins and included them in jewelry or cup linings. These beliefs, while unproven, offered psychological comfort to those who lived in constant suspicion. Guards stood near tables, their eyes trained not on invaders at the door, but on the servants within the hall. The kitchen staff, though loyal, were watched. The wine cellar was often locked and guarded, and the kitchens, large, hot, chaotic, became a theater of both culinary artistry and whispered concern. Not all poisons were immediate. Some worked slowly, causing fatigue, tremors, or confusion. These symptoms might be mistaken for illness, giving the poisoner time to escape suspicion. Others were fast and cruel. Rumors abounded of nobles collapsing mid-feast, their final breaths still heavy with the scent of cinnamon or wine. The political climate made such fears rational. Alliances were fragile, inheritances contested, and betrayal a frequent companion in noble courts. Poison required no armies, no open conflict, just access and cunning. A single compromised servant, a tainted spice, a dose dissolved in honey. It was an elegant weapon in a brutal age. Cookbooks from the period, surprisingly, included antidotes alongside recipes. Vinegar and milk were common remedies. Ground pearls, crushed emeralds, and theriac, a compound of dozens of ingredients, were consumed in hope of resisting poison's effects. These were luxuries only the wealthy could afford, and even they were no guarantee of survival. This ever-present fear altered behavior. Nobles dined in small circles, avoided unfamiliar kitchens, and sometimes chose fasting over feasting when tensions ran high. Trust, once broken, was slow to rebuild. Behind every celebration lay this truth, that power invited envy and envy invited harm. The great hall, with its banners and music, could not drown out the quiet question whispered in the mind of every lord and lady. Is this bite safe? In the world of medieval castles, even luxury came with a price. And for those at the top, the banquet table was both privilege and peril. Medicine in the medieval world was as much a matter of belief as it was of knowledge, and often leaned heavily on the former. Even among the nobility, access to physicians did not guarantee healing. In many cases, it meant submitting to rituals, theories, and treatments that today seem more like punishments than cures. The foundation of medieval medical understanding was a theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was thought to depend on a careful balance between them. Illness, therefore, was a matter of imbalance, and treatment aimed to restore equilibrium. This could mean bloodletting, induced vomiting, purging, or the application of leeches. The more severe the symptoms, the more aggressive the methods employed. For nobles, physicians were summoned from respected circles, often university-trained and learned in Latin texts. But their knowledge, drawn largely from Galen and Hippocrates, was centuries old and rarely updated. Observation played a minor role. Instead, diagnosis relied on examining the color of urine, the texture of a tongue, or the rhythm of a pulse, guided more by doctrine than by science. A noble suffering from fever might be bled from the arm with a silver knife, the blood collected and examined for signs of imbalance. If that failed, they might be offered a potion brewed from herbs, animal fats, and even powdered gems, an expensive blend with no guaranteed benefit. Illnesses of the mind or spirit might be treated with prayer, pilgrimage, or wearing charms to ward off evil. Infections were misunderstood. Wounds were cleaned with wine or vinegar, but rarely sterilized. If rot set in, physicians had little recourse. Amputation was known, but without anesthesia or antiseptics, the procedure was perilous. Nobles often refused it, choosing suffering over the likelihood of death on the table. Some treatments were purely symbolic. Gold leaf was thought to restore vitality. Ground pearls could aid digestion. Unicorn horn, usually narwhal tusk, was prized as an antidote to poison. These ingredients, while fashionable, were more valuable than effective. Their use spoke to desperation and belief, rather than knowledge. Mental illness was cloaked in fear. Noble women who suffered from what might now be recognized as depression or anxiety were prescribed quiet seclusion, prayer, or even exorcism. Men who raved from fever or trauma were considered cursed or dangerous. The concept of psychological care was centuries away. Astrology also influenced treatment. Physicians consulted the stars before prescribing medicines or conducting surgeries. A procedure might be delayed because Mars was ascendant or the moon was waning. To modern minds, this seems quaint, but to a medieval noble, it was a trusted precaution. Ironically, the poorer sometimes fared better. Peasants relied on folk remedies, herbs from the forest. Wisdom passed from midwives and herbalists. Their cures, while unsophisticated, often addressed symptoms with practical knowledge. Nobles, trapped by prestige and tradition, placed their fates in hands guided by books rather than lived experience. Thus, while castles offered protection and privilege, they could not shield nobles from the consequences of flawed medicine. To be ill within stone walls was to submit to methods that soothed the mind more than the body, and often left one weaker than before. The image of luxury, once again, concealed a harsher truth, that even the highest born, when fevered or injured, were at the mercy of beliefs more mystical than medical, and many did not recover. They dined with silver forks and silent risk. And beneath the illusion of abundance, hunger for truly wholesome food, untainted, unspoiled, lingered quietly. In the quiet elegance of a great hall or the solemn pomp of a castle chapel, a nobleman or noblewoman might appear radiant, cloaked in brocade, stitched with gold thread, framed in velvet and fur. But beneath the splendor, beneath the layers of carefully tailored fabric, was a truth rarely spoken of and seldom recorded. Fashion, for medieval elite, was often a burden. For nobles, clothing was not merely protection from the elements. It was a declaration of power, wealth, and status. Every layer, every texture, every color sent a message. A high collar suggested nobility. Sumptuary laws restricted certain colors and fabrics to particular ranks. Violet, for instance, was reserved for royalty or those with papal approval. The cost of acquiring such colors, especially those derived from rare dyes, was staggering, and the garments themselves were constructed not for comfort, but for display. For women, gowns were layered to an almost absurd degree. A chemise, worn closest to the skin, was followed by a kirtle, then a surcoat, and perhaps a cloak if the occasion called for it. The outermost fabrics were often thick, rigid, and embroidered with metallic thread. Sleeves were long and trailing, dragging across floors. Bodices were laced tight, limiting breath and movement. Even in summer months, noble women might be swathed in wool and lined fur, as the social expectation to appear regal outweighed personal discomfort. Men fared little better. The fashion of the 14th and 15th centuries saw the rise of the doublet. Tight-fitting and padded, worn with hose that left little room for comfort. Codpieces, exaggerated in later centuries, began as a response to the impractical fit of hose that split at the crotch. Cloaks, tabards, and heavy mantles completed the ensemble, often weighing several kilograms in total. In hot weather, these garments became oppressive. Ventilation was poor, perspiration unavoidable, and options for relief were few. Changing clothes multiple times a day was uncommon, even for the elite. Garments were too costly and too complex to don without help. Bathing, as noted before, was infrequent, and garments were often scented with herbs or doused in perfume to mask odors rather than washed. The discomfort extended beyond temperature. Movement was restricted by tight seams and stiff fabrics. Riding, walking, or climbing stairs required deliberate, rehearsed motions. Young nobles were trained to walk with poise in these outfits, to sit with grace even when the stiff boning of a corset dug into the ribs or a high collar chafed the neck. Fashion also shaped posture and gait. Corsets and stays alter how a woman sat, how she breathed. Stiffened shoulder pieces or padded rolls affected how a man held himself. These postures projected elegance but were not natural, and over time, they could cause strain or injury. Joints ached, muscles fatigued, But complaints were rare, for to suffer silently in finery was itself a kind of virtue. Even children were not exempt. Noble boys and girls were dressed as miniature adults, complete with restrictive clothing and ceremonial accessories. They learned early that to be noble was to endure, and that appearance mattered more than ease. Sumptuary laws made changing these styles difficult. A noble who dressed too simply might be accused of failing their station, or worse, of aligning with commoners. A woman who wore practical garb could be seen as immodest or rebellious. Thus, the tyranny of fashion was not just personal, but cultural and legal. In private, some nobles may have changed into simpler robes, but even these were made of rich materials, and the expectations of servants, guests, and visitors meant that a truly comfortable existence was hard to maintain. Layers of silk and wool kept them wrapped not only in fabric, but in a constant performance of identity. Behind every elegant silhouette was a person whose skin itched, whose ribs ached, whose movements were calculated and constrained. And while portraits and statues immortalized these figures in timeless grace, the reality was far less forgiving. Asterisk, beneath the polished etiquette and candlelit glamour of castle life, lay a web of social rituals so tightly woven that even moments of pleasure were often bound by tension. For nobles and those serving them, medieval castles operated under unyielding expectations of behavior, where every movement and word was guided by custom and watched by others. Daily life was structured around protocol, from the moment one rose in the morning to the final bow at evening prayer. Every interaction was framed by hierarchy. Who spoke first, who sat where, who entered a room ahead of whom. These were not idle details, but signals of one's place in the great ladder of society. Even smiles, gestures, and glances had to be measured, lest they be misunderstood or deemed inappropriate. Dining, for instance, was a performance. Meals in the great hall were public, ceremonial affairs. Nobles dined in silence or under strict conversational rules. Servants moved in choreographed patterns. Guests were expected to compliment the food, though they dared not eat too quickly or too much. To show appetite could be mistaken for greed. To refuse a dish might offend. There was no lounging over a plate, no idle chatter between bites. Even laughter had to be carefully timed. The liturgical calendar further dictated much of the rhythm of life. Feasts and fasts alternated, each with its own complex traditions. Christmas might mean 12 nights of entertainment and feasting, but also demanded constant hosting, managing, and monitoring of both guests and servants. Lent, on the other hand, brought dietary restrictions and religious obligations, replacing ease with scrutiny and penance. Even leisure was regimented. Hunting, a favored pastime among the nobility, was not merely a sport but a statement of power and control. Who could participate, what animals could be pursued, and what attire was worn, all were determined by status. A misstep in behavior or attire could be socially ruinous. Tournaments and dances, while outwardly joyful, were fraught with rules and risks. A misplaced foot in a formal dance could embarrass one's family. A poorly chosen word during courtly conversation might be interpreted as disrespect. In a world without second chances for social missteps, even relaxation was performance. Religious observance offered little reprieve. Nobles were expected to attend multiple services a day, sponsor chapels, and demonstrate piety through charitable acts. Prayer was not only a private communion, but a public demonstration. Failing to kneel with the right posture or recite the correct Latin responses could draw censure. Spiritual devotion became another arena in which one's worth was measured. Even solitude was hard-won. Privacy was rare, especially for noble women, who were often accompanied by maids, ladies-in-waiting, or chaperones. Letters, too, were read by others before reaching their recipients. Bedrooms were shared, travel was monitored, and every movement was noted. In this environment, spontaneity wilted. Joy, if it came, was quiet and fleeting. A warm look from a friend, a song hummed in a corridor, a breath of fresh air taken without being watched. These were the true luxuries. Unscripted, unguarded moments that slipped between the cracks of ritual. For castle dwellers, especially those of high rank, pleasure was filtered through obligation. Duty sat at every table, stood behind every door, and lingered in every chamber. And while tapestry spoke of triumph and music filled echoing halls, many hearts beat in step not with joy, but with expectation. The social rituals that held castles together were both glue and chain. They maintained order, yes, but at the cost of ease, at the cost of laughter, at the cost of freedom. And so, beneath the gilded surface of castle life, nobles lived not in indulgence, but in constant awareness. Each hour another act, each day another test. Asterisk, in the great halls and candlelit chambers of medieval castles, nobility came wrapped in splendor, but also in quiet, constant weight. The higher one stationed, the tighter the grip of expectation. Titles offered status, but also scrutiny. Inheritance brought security, but also suspicion. And for many, especially women and young heirs, castle life was not a sanctuary, but carefully choreographed performance, where every misstep had consequences. From an early age, noble children were groomed not for happiness, but for duty. Heirs were expected to embody strength, intelligence, and piety. They were drilled in Latin, taught falconry, trained in the art of war, even before they truly understood what war was. Their friendships were curated, their mistakes noted, their futures already written. To be an heir was to live under constant gaze of elders, courtiers, and tutors, all watching to ensure the legacy remained intact. And that legacy often came with unspoken threats. From cousins with claims, from alliances that could shift, from expectations that could never be fully met. For daughters of nobility, the role was even more constrained. A noblewoman's path was narrow: marriage, alliance, motherhood. Her worth was often measured by her ability to bear sons, her capacity to manage a household, her silence in public. She lived in rooms filled with servants, but often lacked true confidence. Conversations were polite, but not always genuine. The pressure to appear graceful, serene, and composed left little room for fear, sadness, or rage. And when those emotions came, they were often pressed into embroidery, whispered into locked diaries, or hidden in ritual and routine. Paranoia was not a flaw in this world. It was a form of self-preservation. Poisonings, betrayal, and covert power plays were not fiction. They were the undercurrents of court life. A word whispered in the wrong ear, a favor granted too freely, a marriage refused. Each carried risk. To survive the politics of nobility required constant vigilance. Even leisure could not be trusted. A hunting trip could end in accident. A feast might bring sickness. A smile might hide a plot. Servants might report secrets. Siblings might compete quietly or not so quietly for affection, wealth, or title. For the aging patriarch or matriarch, the fear of being usurped or forgotten gnawed quietly. Illness exposed weakness. Advisors could turn. A younger sibling might become ambitious. To maintain power meant staying relevant, composed, and feared, but never too cold, never too kind. It was a balance impossible to hold for long. Even in their waning years, nobles could not afford to let their guard down. A cough could lead to whispers of succession. A stumble might invite scheming. Their legacies, built over decades, could begin to fray in a matter of weeks. Religious expectation added yet another layer. Nobles were expected to donate land, sponsor churches, attend mass, fund monastic orders. Yet beneath piety was calculation. A generous donation could buy loyalty or forgiveness, but if offered too freely, it might be seen as desperation. Even one's relationship with God became a tool for social navigation. Dying without visible devotion could tarnish an entire family's standing. Thus, chapels were built, relics purchased, and monks employed to pray daily endlessly for souls not yet departed. And all the while, true intimacy was scarce. Marriage was rarely about love. Servants, while ever present, were not peers. Advisors had motives. Fellow nobles had agendas. In this world of candlelight and courtly games, solitude was the only honest companion. Diaries, when they existed, are filled with longing for simplicity, for authenticity, for peace. Some nobles turned to writing or poetry, others to prayer, but most simply endured, wrapped in silk and expectation. Among the tapestries and carved stone, fear lived quietly. It wore perfume. It bowed politely. And it never, ever left the room. For every grand feast, there were whispered rumors. For every crowned heir, a shadow of competition. For every glowing marriage, a dozen silent compromises. Nobility was a performance without intermission. A theater where forgetting your lines could mean exile, or worse. So while the world may remember the gowns and the gold, those who lived behind castle walls knew the truth. That power, once gained, had to be guarded. That privilege was not peace. That the higher one climbed, the lonelier it became. In the great halls and candlelit chambers of medieval castles, nobility came wrapped in splendor, but also in quiet, constant weight. The higher one stationed, the tighter the grip of expectation. Titles offered status, but also scrutiny. Inheritance brought security, but also suspicion. And for many, especially women and young heirs, castle life was not a sanctuary, but a carefully choreographed performance, where every misstep had consequences. From an early age, noble children were groomed not for happiness, but for duty. Heirs were expected to embody strength, intelligence, and piety. They were drilled in Latin, taught falconry, trained in the art of war. Even before they truly understood what war was, their friendships were curated, their mistakes noted, their futures already written. To be an heir was to live under the constant gaze of elders, courtiers, and tutors, all watching to ensure the legacy remained intact. For daughters of nobility, the role was even more constrained. A noblewoman's path was narrow: marriage, alliance, motherhood. Her worth was often measured by her ability to bear sons, her capacity to manage a household, her silence in public. She lived in rooms filled with servants, but often lacked true confidence. Conversations were polite, but not always genuine. The pressure to appear graceful, serene, and composed left little room for fear, sadness, or rage. Paranoia was not a flaw in this world. It was a form of self-preservation. Poisonings, betrayal, and covert power plays were not fiction. They were the undercurrent of court life. A word whispered in the wrong ear, a favor granted too freely, a marriage refused. Each carried risk. To survive the politics of nobility required constant vigilance. Even leisure could not be trusted. A hunting trip could end in accident. A feast might bring sickness. A smile might hide a plot. For the aging patriarch or matriarch, the fear of being usurped or forgotten gnawed quietly. Illness exposed weakness. Advisors could turn. A younger sibling might become ambitious. To maintain power meant staying relevant, composed, and feared, but never too cold, never too kind. It was a balance impossible to hold for long. Religious expectation added yet another layer. Nobles were expected to donate land, sponsor churches, attend mass, fund monastic orders. Yet beneath piety was calculation. A generous donation could buy loyalty or forgiveness, but if offered too freely, it might be seen as desperation. Even one's relationship with God became a tool for social navigation, and all the while, true intimacy was scarce. Marriage was rarely about love. Servants, while ever present, were not peers. Advisors had motives. Fellow nobles had agendas. In this world of candlelight and courtly games, solitude was the only honest companion. Diaries, when they existed, are filled with longing for simplicity, for authenticity, for peace. Among the tapestries and carved stone, fear lived quietly. It wore perfume. It bowed politely. And it never, ever left the room. Conclusion. So now, as the candlelight dims and the embers quiet in your mind, you may begin to feel the slow hush of sleep settle in. We've walked these stony halls together, past dripping ceilings, threadbare cloaks, and long-forgotten names etched faintly into castle dust. We've stood beside the hearths that never truly warmed, tasted the crust left behind by feasts never ours, and listened to the echo of footsteps in corridors where few dared to speak. The towering castles of medieval Europe were not just monuments of grandeur or power. They were places of labor, silence, and constant strain. For those at the bottom and those at the top, behind every thick curtain and beneath every heavy crown was a weight carried quietly. The stories of lords and ladies were never whole without the whispers of the servants, the prayers of the unseen, and the worn hands of the forgotten. But time has softened those stones. The cold has faded. The echoes now belong to wind. And here you are, in the warmth of your bed, far from the drafts and rituals of castle life. The hardship has passed. The flicker of their lives now lives in memory, distant, like a dream, like a lullaby sung across the centuries. So let the past stay quiet now. Let the castle walls dissolve gently into sleep. And may your night be free of their weight, their watchfulness, and their worry. Rest easy. You've wandered far enough tonight. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.